Committees will come to order. First, I'd like to thank our administration witnesses today for fulfilling Secretary Rice's commitment that the Department would provide witnesses to appear before our subcommittees. This is the beginning of what I believe should be intensive and continuous consultations with the Congress on the nature and substance of the agreements to be negotiated between the United States and Iraq as envisioned in the November 26, 2007 Declaration of Principles. I suspect that the administration is somewhat surprised by the reaction to the declaration here in Congress, and that they probably wish they had drafted the document with a little bit more of precision. On their face, the plain meaning of the words in the declaration look to us very much like a commitment for U.S. forces to defend the government of Iraq against foreign and domestic threats in perpetuity. Since the declaration was released, there has been testimony by Secretary Rice and Secretary Gates, an op-ed piece by the two secretaries in the Washington Post, and there has been a classified briefing before the Foreign Affairs Committee, all designed to tell us what the security agreement to be negotiated won't do. It won't mandate that we continue combat missions. It won't set troop levels. It won't commit the United States to join Iraq in a war against another country or provide other such security commitments. And it won't authorize permanent bases. So far, so good. But it isn't entirely clear yet what the proposed security agreement will do. Secretaries Rice and Gates suggested in their Washington Post piece 2 weeks ago that the agreement will provide appropriate authorities to help the Iraqi government, quote, fight al-Qaeda, develop its security forces, and stem the flow of lethal weapons and training from Iran, unquote. We're also told that we shouldn't worry so much about this agreement because we have these types of agreements with 115 other nations around the world covering everything from authority to fight to delivering the mail. With respect, I think the agreement that both secretaries are describing is likely to be a little more robust than what would be necessary to ensure that our soldiers get their Christmas greeting cards. And therein lies the problem. Describing the proposed agreement as merely routine is, I believe, disingenuous at best. There is nothing routine about it or the situation in Iraq. And trying to dampen concerns in Congress by suggesting that the declaration doesn't mean everything that it says suggests that the administration either doesn't understand English or has deliberately misled the Iraqis. Neither interpretation is flattering. What exactly did Prime Minister al-Maliki think when he signed a document that provided the United States, quote, security assurances and commitments to the Republic of Iraq to deter foreign aggression against Iraq, unquote? Did he think President Bush was just kidding? Or does he think he and his government actually expect us to help if the neighbors start getting too pushy? And if he does expect help, what does he think that help looks like? Leading Congress to believe one thing and the Iraqis another is a recipe for political disaster at home and a diplomatic catastrophe abroad. The most likely outcome of such irresponsible behavior is the loss of the last remnants of our national reputation. And bearing those political costs in mind, let's go back to one of the things that Secretaries Rice and Gates say the agreement won't do. It won't mandate combat missions. That sounds like good news, but based on their essay, it won't prohibit combat missions either. So the administration clearly expects that the U.S. forces will continue to be engaged in combat in Iraq beyond the expiration of the UN mandate later this year, which in turn means the administration will need authority for U.S. forces to fight, authority for them to take prisoners, and presumably immunity from Iraqi law for our soldiers. According to a New York Times story from January, and without objection I'll put the story in the record, seeing none, so ordered, the Bush administration has drafted such an agreement. It contains broad authority to conduct military operations, guarantees immunity from Iraqi law for U.S. forces and contractors, and provides the United States with power to detain Iraqi prisoners. If the proposed agreement is as the New York Times describes, that sounds to me much more than a status of forces agreement and anything but routine. It sounds more like a commitment for continued open-ended combat, and I think it would constitute precisely the type of long-term commitment that should not be entered into during the current administration without the express approval of Congress. As a matter of constitutional principle, and as a matter of sound foreign policy, and as a matter of plain old common sense, it seems to me that U.S. security commitments, and especially solemn promises to defend another nation, should come in the form of a treaty. Even in instances where we have reserved for ourselves the right to intervene to defend another nation, we have done repeatedly, as we have done repeatedly in Latin America, those interventions were based on a treaty ratified by the Senate, whatever one might think about the treaties themselves. While some have pointed out to our current operations in Afghanistan as a precedent, the underlying legal authority for our presence there comes from the Congress and from the international community in the form of United Nations mandates, not from a bilateral agreement with the administration of Afghanistan. So far, what I know about the administration's intentions leads me to the inexorable conclusion that there is quite a lot for us to be concerned about, that Congress does need to be intensely involved in this process, and that this afternoon's hearing, as I noted, is only the beginning of our discussions and not the end. The State Department's own rules require it to always ensure, quote, that the utmost care is exercised to avoid any invasion or compromise of the constitutional powers of the President, the Senate, and the Congress as a whole, unquote. My thoughts exactly. Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank you and Chairman Delahunt for persisting.
Closer on the mic.
I'd like to thank you and Chairman Delahunt for persisting. This is the fifth hearing about the road ahead for the United States in Iraqi relations. In November of 2007, President Bush and Iraqi Prime Minister al-Maliki signed a defense agreement that appeared to commit the United States to a long-term military relationship with Iraq. From what little we know of that agreement, called the Declaration of Principles, it may or may not be something that needs congressional approval. We simply do not have enough information about the agreement that is being negotiated to know if Congress should have a role. Mr. Chairman, you and Chairman Delahunt have rightfully held hearings to determine the nature of this agreement, and I am pleased that the administration has finally responded to your requests to provide witnesses to discuss this issue. It is unfortunate that the administration ignored invitations to testify at our 4 previous hearings, and I applaud Chairman Delahunt for bringing this issue up directly with the Secretary of State. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, who I deeply respect, was asked by Chairman Delahunt directly whether or not she would provide witnesses for a hearing on this issue. That was at a full committee hearing on and the State Department budget for 2009, and much to her credit, Secretary of State Rice, who I deeply respect, immediately replied yes in the affirmative, and that no doubt is why we have finally the joy of having with us representatives of the administration to explain a policy that should not have required such an enormous effort on our part to get you here. Since the Declaration of Principles Agreement was signed, the administration has clarified that the document was not intended to hold the U.S. to a long-term commitment to Iraq. When Secretary of Defense Gates testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee last February, he told the panel the Status of Forces Agreement that is being discussed will not contain a commitment to defend Iraq, and neither will any strategic framework agreement. Well, with our eye on the future, we should note that an immediate, hasty withdrawal of Americans from Iraq will simply provide the opportunity for evil forces, which I consider evil forces, in that region to fill our vacuum. However, we need to know exactly what is the plan and what we intend to do, what the United States intends to do, and what this administration intends to commit us to do in the future. You know, Congress, I remember there was some hearings where someone was there and he said, you know, I'm not just a potted plant, I'm here to participate. Well, Congress is not just a potted plant when it comes to helping determine America's long-term policy. And unfortunately, this administration has not shown the cooperative spirit that is necessary for us to succeed as a nation. And I think they've been undermining their own ability to put forth a policy in Iraq that will work, and it should not have taken. And this is perhaps what we're facing today, and what I'm saying is precisely the reason why the administration is having troubles. Not because of this end, because it took us so long to get you in those seats to talk to us about this issue. As this complex situation continues in Iraq, I would hope that we have more such discussions and that the administration has more witnesses. I actually agree with the administration on many of its foreign policy goals in Iraq. I've always been in agreement with it, but I've always understood that these decisions as to what policy it should be does not rest simply with the President of the United States and the executive branch. George Bush was elected president. He was not elected king. There is too much at stake in this game for one-upmanship or turf battles dealing with Congress and the executive branch. We are all here at the behest of the American people, and they have a right to know where their government is taking them, and for us to discuss it and figure out if that is the right decision of which way to go. They, like the administration, the American people, want an honorable end to the military involvement that we have in Iraq, an honorable end that will not lead to worse consequences in the future. That's what we're all about. Well, we owe the American people a transparent process to discuss how to reach that end, that honorable end that will not put us in jeopardy in the future. And I'm looking forward to hearing what the administration has to say. I lament that it's taken us so long to get this discussion to happen. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank Chairman Dillahunt for the effort that he's put in to this endeavor. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman from California. I doubly thank him for his being even-handed, not because he agrees with some of the perspective that has been so far expressed, but that he's an equal opportunity administration basher and has not been reticent to do that, regardless of whether the administration was of his party or not, or whether he's been in the majority or the minority. And your fairness, whether we all agree or disagree, is duly noted. Turn next to Chairman Dillahunt, whose committee shares with us today the honors of holding this hearing. And let me just say that it's very, very good and sends a very strong message that our committees can work together on so many of these issues. Chairman Delahunt.
Well, thank you, Chairman Ackerman, and let me just express my gratitude to you for your leadership on many of the complex issues surrounding our involvement in Iraq. And I, too, am very grateful for the opportunity to share this dais with you at this particular hearing. And let me also echo your compliments to my ranking member, Mr. Rohrabacher. He's many things, but one thing that can be said of Dana Rohrabacher, he is fair, he is forthright, and we share the same view in terms of the necessity of vigorous oversight. And he's also my friend. This hearing,
not to be used in your campaign.
yeah. Maybe if I endorse him, we can gain a seat out there somewhere in California. This hearing is of particular importance. It's not only about the future of the bilateral relationship between Iraq and the United States, but also about the constitutional role of Congress in authorizing the use of American military force overseas. I would submit that it is not only our prerogative, but our obligation to ensure that the constitutional responsibility of Congress in the authorization of military force is not further eroded. The announcement of the Declaration of Principles with its expansive menu of potentially significant commitments in the economic, political, and security spheres went largely unnoticed in Congress. My own awareness was prompted by the public opposition of a majority of the Iraqi parliament to the one-year renewal of the UN mandate last December, which, according to legal experts on the Iraq Constitution, should have required a two-thirds vote of approval by the Iraqi parliament. That approval was never obtained by the Maliki government. This apparent violation of the Iraq Constitution was seemingly ignored by the Security Council and the Bush administration. And it behooves us to remember that the Iraqi parliament is the only body in Iraq directly elected by the Iraqi people. And it's further interesting to note that the opposition of the Iraqi parliament was based on the failure to incorporate in the renewal an explicit timetable for the withdrawal of American troops. In the Declaration of Principles, the Bush administration and the Maliki government has signaled an intention to negotiate a broad agreement that would replace the UN mandate upon its expiration in December of this year. On its face, the declaration would set the stage for American security commitments that are unprecedented. These would include, and I'll quote from the actual language of the declaration, supporting the Republic of Iraq in defending its democratic system against internal and external threats, and providing security assurances and commitments to the Republic of Iraq to deter foreign aggression against Iraq. In light of the magnitude of these apparent commitments that were being discussed, I found it particularly disturbing that General Lute, for whom I have great respect, and is serving as the President's Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan, had this to say, that such agreements would not require formal negotiations or formal inputs from Congress. Congress, in other words, would be left out of that decision. In addition, there has been an effort by the administration to equate whatever is negotiated to a typical status of forces agreement, which is nothing more fundamentally an agreement that relates to legal immunities for U.S. military personnel and others. But the Declaration of Principles contemplates something far more expansive than that kind of arrangement. And I would note that Secretaries Rice and Gates, in a recent op-ed piece, continue to present the status of forces agreements, the acronym being SOFAs, as something they are not, something of much greater consequence. They state that the status of force agreements range from, and this is their description, authority to fight to rules for delivering the mail. The key phrase I would suggest here is the authority to fight, and that requires congressional approval. We have testimony from a hearing that I chaired just last Thursday, when testimony from the Congressional Research Service stated that there had been a review of some 70 status of forces agreements achieved by a sole executive agreement, and found not one example of a provision that conferred authority to fight. The overwhelming consensus of scholars who have testified in the previous 4 hearings before our subcommittees is that the authority to fight is a power to be shared between Congress and the executive. One of our previous witnesses, Professor Michael Glennon, former counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, made this point in a letter that he sent me for this hearing, and I would ask that it be made part of the record. Let me quote from his letter. Under U.S. domestic law, authority for the President to use force, authority to fight in Iraq must either come from the Constitution or the Congress. The agreement with Iraq, which apparently will be entered into as a sole executive agreement, therefore could not serve as a source of such authority. And therefore, I reject the position held by the administration that no formal input approved or approval by the Congress are required. While the term strategic framework agreement has been alluded to by administration officials, it now appears, after reviewing Ambassador Satterfield's statement, that in fact there are 2 separate and distinct agreements that are being considered. The ambassador states that the strategic framework agreement will broadly address the topics outlined in the Declaration of Principles, and that it and the status of forces agreement together will constitute, and again, this is the ambassador's written testimony, an accord that both affirms Iraqi sovereignty and continues to permit U.S. and coalition forces to assist in restraining extremists and outside actors who seek power through terror and violence, should the U.S. administration and Iraqi government deem such operations necessary. In light of this testimony, I would conclude that our Constitution requires congressional approval of such a so-called strategic framework agreement, because such an accord necessarily implicates the authority to fight. And as others have said, the decision to use force overseas, except for limited defensive purposes, requires a collective judgment of the political branches of the government. I look forward particularly to the Ambassador's testimony on this point, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Delahunt. The Chair would ask for unanimous consent of the committee to allow Representative DeLaura, who is not a member of the committee, to sit with the committee as if she were a member of the committee for purposes of this hearing. Seeing no objection, it is so ordered. Ms. DeLaura, would you like to?
Mr. Chairman, I want to just say thank you to you and to Mr. Delahunt and Mr. Rohrabacher for the opportunity to be here today. I will be very brief in my remarks, and again, thank you, because I do not sit on this committee, but this is an extremely important issue, and where I have looked into it and established legislation around it, and you've been wonderful, Mr. Delahunt has, and yourself, and cordial in allowing me to participate in the discussions. So I want to also thank Mr. Satterfield for being here today to represent the State Department, and Assistant Secretary Long from the Department of Defense. I really am very glad to see the administration is finally beginning to follow through on its commitment to, quote, openness and transparency. In particular, I hope today's testimony will shed light on Secretaries Rice and Gates' February 13th op-ed claiming that a status of force agreement would give the United States a, quote, authority to fight, end quote. According to the Congressional Research Service, that simply is not true. Status of force agreements are meant instead to provide the framework for legal protections and rights while the U.S. personnel are present in a country for agreed-upon purposes. Rice and Gates wrote that, quote, nothing will commit the United States to join Iraq in a war against another country or provide other such security commitments, end quote. Yet, the very next day, the Iraqi foreign minister said that he was hoping the agreement would bring a, and I quote again, continued commitment by the United States government to stand by the Iraqi government against foreign threats and against internal threats, end quote. Clearly, this is much more than the typical status of forces agreement, and we should not rush to finalize any agreement of this magnitude just because the Iraqis would prefer not to extend the UN mandate, which has been in place nearly 4 years. It is in both our nation's best interest to persuade the Iraqi people to extend the UN mandate. Any future agreement could then be finalized by a new administration and a Congress that will be responsible for implementing it in the years ahead. I look forward to hearing the witnesses' testimony on these critical issues, and once again, I thank Mr. Delahunt and Mr. Ackerman for inviting me to participate in this hearing.
Thank you, Ms. DeLaura. There being no further members to be recognized, we will turn to our first panel. Ambassador David Satterfield is Senior Advisor to the Secretary of State and Coordinator for Iraq. He has held that position since August 2006. Immediately prior to that, he was Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. Ambassador Satterfield was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs from June 2001 until June 2004. And before that, he served as our ambassador to Lebanon. A career Foreign Service officer, Ambassador Satterfield has served on the National Security Council staff from 1993 to 1996. Ambassador Satterfield joined the Foreign Service in 1980 and has served as overseas in Jeddah, Tunis, Beirut, and Damascus. In addition, he has held various positions in the Bureaus of Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs and Intelligence and Research, and has been Director of the Executive Secretariat Staff, recipient of numerous awards for his service to our nation. Ambassador Satterfield attended the University of Maryland and Georgetown University. Welcome to you, Ambassador. Mary Beth Long is Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and has held that position since December of last year. Immediately prior to that, she was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in that same office. Ms. Long also served for several years as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Counter-Narcotics, and in that capacity oversaw the department's global counter-narcotics efforts. From 1986 to 1999, Ms. Long worked for the Central Intelligence Agency and the Directorate of Operations on issues ranging from counter-narcotics to money laundering to terrorism. In 1996, she served as the Deputy and Acting Chief for the agency's Haiti Task Force. Ms. Long is a graduate of Pennsylvania State University and Washington and Lee University School of Law. Secretary Long, welcome to you as well. I understand that the State Department has no written statement to present. Defense Department has no written statement to present, but will make remarks for us on the record. And for the record, let me say it's the intent of the Chair to press our witnesses to be specific about the nature of the security commitments we intend to make to Iraq, whether those commitments will be legally binding on the United States, and whether they will be public or secret. With that, Ambassador Satterfield, we will begin with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Delahunt, I would ask concurrence to enter my written remarks into the record. I have some brief oral remarks.
Could you pull the microphone a little bit closer?
Certainly. Would ask for concurrence, please, for my written remarks to be entered into the record. I have some brief opening oral remarks.
Could you pull it closer yet? Or could we turn up the volume?
Chairman, is this?
Much better.
That's better. Thank you. Chairman Ackerman, Chairman Delahunt, I would ask permission for my written remarks to be entered into the record. I have brief oral remarks to open with.
Without objection.
Chairman Ackerman, Chairman Delahunt, Congressman Rohrabacher, members. Appreciate the opportunity to appear before you all today to discuss the U.S. government's progress towards developing a basic framework for normalized relations with the Iraqi government, which would include what is known as a Status of Forces Agreement. Our overarching goal in Iraq is to help the Iraqi people establish their country as a stable, peaceful, democratic nation with an effective sovereign government that can meet its people's needs, all its people's needs, and play a positive role in the region and in the international community. There is understandable and vigorous debate about the future presence, role, and composition of U.S. forces in Iraq. But this administration believes that in pursuit of basic and long-standing U.S. interests, that U.S. forces will need to operate in Iraq beyond the end of this year. The government of Iraq has expressed its strong desire that the United Nations Chapter 7 mandate expire at the end of this year. The United States and the United Nations Security Council support this objective. It is imperative that the United States negotiate with the government of Iraq an agreement that would provide all necessary legal authorities and protections for our troops to continue to operate in Iraq, an agreement which is in its shape similar in many respects to SOFAs we have across the world, but which will take into account the particular circumstances and requirements for our forces in this country, in Iraq. In addition to a Status of Forces Agreement, we intend to establish a strategic framework for a strong relationship with Iraq, reflecting our shared political, economic, cultural, and security goals and interests. This strategic framework will broadly address the topics outlined in the Declaration of Principles signed by President Bush and Prime Minister Maliki on November 26, 2007. Both the Status of Forces Agreement and the strategic framework come at the urging of the Iraqi government and moderate political forces from across the spectrum of Iraq's ethnic, religious, and political communities. Together, they seek an accord that both affirms Iraqi sovereignty and will permit the continued assistance of U.S. and coalition forces in that nation's progress towards full security and peace. Ambassador Crocker, our ambassador in Baghdad, will serve as the lead negotiator. The Iraqi side is establishing a broadly representative and technically capable team Formal negotiations will begin this month, starting with overall contextual or framing briefs to begin in the days ahead. The Status of Forces Agreement, Mr. Chairman, will set the basic legal parameters for the United States military presence in Iraq, including the appropriate authorities and protections essential for our troops to operate effectively. These provisions are vital for our military. We owe it to our troops in Iraq to obtain for them the protections they have elsewhere in the world. The framework and the Status of Forces Agreement will not tie the hands of the next president or indeed this president. They will ensure that every policy option remains on the table. The size of the U.S. presence in Iraq, the missions to be performed by such forces if forces are present, are decisions for the president and for the next president to make. The framework and the Status of Forces Agreement will not include a binding commitment to defend Iraq or any other security commitments that would warrant Senate advice and consent. I wish to be clear, they will not establish permanent bases in Iraq, nor will they specify in any fashion the number of American forces to be stationed there. In keeping with past practice regarding such agreements, our intent is to conclude the Status of Forces Agreement as an executive agreement, rather than a treaty. Congress will be consulted throughout the entire process, as Secretary of Defense Gates and Secretary of State Rice have noted, as negotiations proceed in the coming months. Over a half-dozen background briefings by senior administration officials, including my colleague, Assistant Secretary Long, have already been held. Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus are scheduled to testify before the Congress next month. As with other negotiations, we will not publicly discuss our negotiating positions, but we will ensure that members of Congress are kept fully informed. The United States, Mr. Chairman, has enduring national interests in Iraq. 2008 is a year of critical transition, both for the United States and for the country and people of Iraq. Our primary objective now is to build a sustainable foundation for success. We are committed to doing everything we can to ensure that the situation in Iraq continues to stabilize and that the next administration has maximum flexibility to consider and to adopt its own policies to conditions and circumstances on the ground. This is precisely what an agreement that we seek with Iraq must and will achieve. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Secretary Long?
I don't have a written or prepared statement other than my appreciation for this subcommittee and for you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to be here. It is in the Defense Department's strong interest that the Strategic Framework Agreement, as well as the SOFA, be negotiated and concluded with the government of Iraq, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Satterfield, the administration has said, and you said again in your testimony today, that there will be no legally binding security commitment, either in a standalone security agreement or as part of a broader framework agreement. When I say security commitment, I mean an obligation that the United States respond to an attack on Iraq by using the armed forces of the United States, or considering an attack on Iraq as an attack on the United States. Can you confirm that there will be no such commitment?
I can so confirm, Mr. Chairman.
In addition to security commitments that have been approved with Senate advice and consent, however, past administrations have often described security arrangements as a pledge by the United States to take some action in the event of a threat to another country's security. An arrangement covers a broader set of commitments, which can be in legally binding or non-legally binding form. They also cover a wide range of potential actions, from a mere requirement consult promptly to a more robust obligation for the United States, for example, to, quote, take measures it deems appropriate, which may include diplomatic, economic, and military measures, unquote. I understand the administration may offer to enter into such an agreement with Iraq as a way of fulfilling the pledge contained in the Declaration of Principles. Can you confirm that any such arrangement will be public and will not be secret?
I can, Mr. Chairman.
Can you state whether any such arrangement will be legally binding or will be part of the non-binding framework agreement that has been discussed in the press? For that matter, will the strategic framework be legally binding?
Mr. Chairman, at present, we contemplate the Status of Forces Agreement to be a legally binding executive agreement in form. With respect to the strategic framework, we do not at this stage contemplate it as a legally binding agreement. Should that change in the course of the discussions, we will, of course, so inform the Congress and will take appropriate measures in accordance with our constitutional provisions. But that is not our intent as we enter these negotiations.
As you assure us that it is not legally binding, can you assure us that it will be part of a separate agreement and not part of any Status of Forces agreement?
We contemplate, Mr. Chairman, as my testimony noted, two separate agreements, a Status of Forces agreement, a strategic framework. They are parallel discussions. They both are associated one with the other in that the strategic framework provides, if you will, the context for the Status of Forces agreement. They are separate, however.
What do you think Mr. Maliki's understanding of the agreement is?
I believe, Mr. Chairman, that Prime Minister Maliki's understanding of the content of the Declaration of Principles, that his understanding of our intent, of the President's intent, as we enter these negotiations on the strategic framework, is that the United States believes its interests, as well as the interests of Iraq, the region, and the international community, are supported by a continued engagement of the United States, military and civilian, in support of the goal of a stable, secure, and peaceful Iraq. He is correct in that understanding.
Let me be a little bit more specific. Is there any way in the world that he thinks that we are going to defend Iraq if Iraq is attacked?
Mr. Chairman, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the President, the Vice President, in all of their conversations with the Prime Minister and other senior Iraqi officials have been quite clear on what our intent is in Iraq, what our obligations are in Iraq, and what they are not. I do not believe such a potential misunderstanding exists.
Has this been explicitly explained to him that if Iraq is attacked, that we have no obligation to enter into any combat missions?
Secretary of Defense has made very clear exactly those points.
And Mr. Maliki is satisfied with that assurance or non-assurance or lack of assurance?
Prime Minister Maliki is
What
strongly...
does he think he's signing?
Mr. Chairman, Prime Minister Maliki is strongly supportive, as we understand, for the initiation of the negotiations about to begin on exactly the basis which I have described to you.
What will happen if Iraq is attacked?
Mr. Chairman, as would be the case of an attack on any friend and partner of the United States, the administration would have to consider, in consultation with the Congress, what would be the best measures to take in defense of United States interests in such an eventuality.
If Iraq is attacked, are you stating uncategorically that the administration will take no action
Mr. Chairman,
until an appropriate course of action is decided in consultation with the Congress?
Mr. Chairman, the administration will act as any administration would act
I'm
in
afraid
defense
of
of U.S. interests.
That wasn't my question.
Mr. Chairman, I can only state that the administration is responsible for the defense of the interests of the United States. It will act in accordance with those interests, but I cannot and will not speculate on hypotheticals.
So it is possible that the administration will not consult with Congress?
Mr. Chairman, the administration will act in defense of U.S. interests.
Is it within the U.S. interest to consult with Congress in the attack of sending our troops to war and putting our sons
Mr.
and
Chairman,
daughters?
these are hypothetical scenarios, and I really cannot comment on them.
So is your agreement. It's based on hypotheticals, is it not?
Mr. Chairman, the agreements, strategic framework and the status of forces agreements, as we have stated, as the Secretaries of State and Defense have noted on the record, will not contain any form of commitment to either presence of U.S. forces or the missions for such forces should they be present. Now, this administration believes, as a matter of policy, that the continued presence of U.S. forces, the effective presence of such forces, will be required beyond the end of this year. But the agreements to be negotiated do not make any such commitment. That is an executive decision.
So the administration is unprepared to commit to consult with Congress should the need for force be necessary.
Mr. Chairman, the administration, like all administrations, has been willing to consult with the Congress as appropriate, but I cannot comment further on a hypothetical scenario.
So the answer is you cannot commit that the administration will consult with Congress should force be used by
The
U.S.
administration will comply fully with all of our constitutional requirements.
And one of them is not consulting with Congress?
Mr. Chairman, the administration will comply fully with all constitutional
Is
procedures.
there a constitutional requirement in your view that the administration consult with Congress
Mr. Chairman, I am
in
not
the commitment of
Mr.
U.S.
Chairman,
forces in the battle zone?
Mr. Chairman, I am not a constitutional lawyer. The administration will comply with all constitutional requirements.
Well, we're here to ask specific questions. This apparently is not your grandmother's sofa. It seems to me we're taking a path that's fraught with danger, and we're just asking for a comfort level based on the constitutional requirement and the requirements of the State Department that consultation be held with Congress before the commitment of forces. And I just want to know, in specific, does the administration intend to comply with that? And you're being very vague in saying that they'll
Mr. Chairman,
something.
the administration will fully comply with all of its constitutional requirements.
Is this a constitutional requirement?
Mr. Chairman, I would defer to constitutional experts on this question.
Is it your understanding? I mean, I read a part of your resume, which is very, very impressive, and I know that sometime you might have read the Constitution. I'm sure you've read it many times. Is it your contention that the administration has to or does not have to consult with Congress? This is a very simple question, which is the nexus of the whole hearing. And we can either answer that question of whether or not that is a constitutional requirement in your view, with the view of the administration, or it's not. Otherwise, everything else is hyperbole, and you've not answered the question. And I think that this Congress, which thinks that it's a partner, at least, in the act of as a last resort, sending America's young people into battle, has a responsibility to know if our administration thinks that we're a partner as well.
And I have said, Mr. Chairman, we will fully comply with all constitutional prerogatives.
And the question is that a constitutional requirement? Does this administration think that anything it wants to do that's not in the Constitution or that is in the Constitution can be twisted any which way that they want to come out with the outcome that they want and ignore what everybody else thinks is a constitutional
Certainly not,
requirement?
Mr. Chairman.
So does it think that there is a constitutional requirement to consult with Congress? Certainly, this has never been discussed in the State Department?
Mr. Chairman,
Whether there's
you've
a
outlined,
constitutional requirement to consult
Mr. Chairman, you've
at going
outlined
to
a number
war?
of scenarios that are hypothetical. And
I'll
asked
ask you
whether,
specifically, has the administration discussed this at any level?
Mr. Chairman, I will respond more formally to that question subsequently to this hearing.
When shall we call that hearing?
Mr. Chairman, we will provide a response to your specific question.
I don't think that we need to close the hearing, and I don't think we need a secret answer as to whether or not the administration thinks going to war is their responsibility and not part of a constitutional obligation to consult with the Congress of the United States. There's a basic issue here. If the administration thinks it can become a bunch of renegades and go to war at any time without consulting the Congress of the United States and the duly elected people by just saying it's going to stick to the Constitution and that's no longer a part of it, this is not a sidebar note that the President makes in a document that he's signing. This is already decided by our constitutional founders as to whether or not we share this power. That's not a hypothetical question. It either is or is not.
Mr. Chairman, your initial hypothetical was if Iraq was attacked,
I'm not
would
asking a
U.S. forces
hypothetical
respond?
question. I'm asking if this administration believes that it is duty-bound and constitutionally required to consult to go to war.
Again, Mr. Chairman, I am not a constitutional expert, but in the event of a declaration...
Neither is anybody else, apparently, that's in your agency or administration.
Mr. Chairman, in the event of a declaration of war, yes, the administration, any administration, would have to make a request to Congress in the event of a declaration of war.
Can the administration go to war in Iraq again without a declaration of war?
Mr. Chairman...
It's the same question.
Mr.
You can
Chairman,
twist it back
I
and
would
it's gonna
ask
come
at
right-
this point if you would please allow us to respond in a formal fashion to that as a taken question. You have asked a number of questions about various hypothetical scenarios ranging from a declaration of war to, quote, an attack on Iraq. They require a more detailed and considered response than I can give you today.
How much time do you need?
24 hours.
We're waiting. Will the staff set the clock? Send out for dinner.
Continue the hearing until 24 hours from now. Right here in public. The gentleman yield.
Has divine intervention taken place? Have we gotten any messages from anywhere? Would you like us to recess for 24 hours and come back?
Mr. Chairman, we have offered to provide a response to
In
the
24
variety
in
of
24
scenarios
hours.
you posed.
I'm sorry?
We will provide a formal response to the variety of hypotheticals that you posed to me.
The Constitution is a document. It's not a hypothetical. This is not a theory that we're discussing. The trouble with the administration is that it thinks that the Constitution is optional. It seems to me that it's already been ratified. I think if we ask the same question of a school child, they'd be able to provide an answer other than it's hypothetical. Your proposal that you'll respond in 24 hours, I'm not sure what you're suggesting.
Mr. Chairman, you posed a number of successive hypothetical scenarios, again, ranging from an attack on Iraq to a declaration of war. You asked what the legal obligation, constitutional obligation of the administration would be in response to this spectrum of events. I'm not a constitutional lawyer. We will provide you with a detailed response to this range of hypotheticals.
Gentleman yield.
There is no range of hypotheticals. I asked you a specific question. You thought it was hypothetical because it hasn't happened yet. And I think planning depends on figuring out what our response is to things that haven't happened. And if you want to know what our response should be, if you want to know why this war went bad, as if any war can go good, is because nobody planned, because everything was hypothetical, except the faith that the administration had that it was right and it was just going ahead, damn the torpedoes, full speed. It is not hypothetical as to what the Constitution requires, and you don't need a team of constitutional experts.
Mr. Chairman, I am prepared, as is my colleague, to brief fully on the proposed negotiations on the status of forces agreement and a strategic framework. We are prepared to address the legal questions that arise in the context of those two documents. With respect to the question you have posed on constitutional requirements in the scenarios you have outlined, we'll be happy to get back to you with a considered and appropriate response.
In 24 hours.
Yes, sir.
Nobody in the agency, nobody in the State Department, nobody in the Defense Department suggested what the Constitution might have within its pages,
Mr. Chairman,
so that two distinguished, experienced, well-educated, patriotic, freedom-loving, defense-protecting members of our administration can't tell us whether or not Congress has a role in declaring war?
Mr. Chairman, there are those in the administration who are able to provide a detailed response to those questions. That is not what we came prepared to brief to today.
You need to get the counsel up here, the legal advisor to the Department of State. It's got to come in front of this committee.
In your negotiating the memorandum of understanding and the status of forces agreement, there were no lawyers involved, or were there?
Mr. Chairman, in the preparation of the initial drafts, the strategic framework, as well as the status of forces agreement, which we are finalizing now before presentation to the Iraqis, of course, our legal teams from defense, from state, from the multinational forces in Iraq were all engaged.
Did those legal people who were engaged know the requirements of the Constitution?
Indeed, they did, sir. And, Mr. Chairman, it is the view of those legal experts from our agencies that nothing in the content of the strategic framework or the status of forces agreement trigger advise and consent constitutional requirements.
But that wasn't the question. It was whether or not we go to war is permissible without consultation and authorization of the Congress.
Mr. Chairman, a declaration of war, of course, requires such actions.
And you will define a military action as not an act of war by just declaring that it's not a declared war.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not certain.
Is that what we're at?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not certain I understand what military actions.
If we're required to use force to deliver the mail and kill people so that the mail can go through, seems to be a use of force.
Mr. Chairman, U.S. forces, coalition forces in Iraq today use force on a continuous basis. This is nothing new. But with the expiration of the Chapter 7 mandate by the end of this year, a new grant of authorities and an understanding with the Iraqi government on the ability to continue combat operations should the President so decide, and associated detainee operations will be required.
Bingo, your license is expiring. Your moral authority to operate is ending.
The Chapter 7 mandate will expire as we intend, as
That's
the
what
Iraqis
you've been
intend
leaning
at the end
pretty
of the year.
heavily on. Where comes the authorization to continue? Who authorizes that?
Mr. Chairman, there are two effective authorizations. With respect to the Iraqi government, an Iraqi government sovereign approval, agreement, authorization will be required in terms of the necessary combat and associated detainee operations, as well as privileges and immunities for our personnel in Iraq with the expiration of the Chapter 7 mandate. The other authorization, in the view of the administration, is the continuing applicability beyond the end of the Chapter 7 mandate of the congressional authorization to use force.
Now it's out. Now,
So you need congressional authorization? Is that what you just said?
Mr. Chairman, the administration believes that that congressional authorization remains in effect beyond the end of the Chapter 7 mandate.
So it is this administration's belief that you have ongoing authorization in perpetuity, despite the fact that the mission has been accomplished, as long as the Iraqis direct you to stay?
No, Mr. Chairman. Mr.
So
Chairman,
who is the authorizing power that you seek?
Mr. Chairman, the Congress authorized the President to use force in Iraq for two reasons: to enforce UN Security Council resolutions and to defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq. Now, at the time of the resolution, the Saddam Hussein regime was the primary threat posed by Iraq. But the Congress recognized it was not the only threat, and that in particular al-Qaeda had a presence in Iraq. The situation in Iraq continues to present a threat to U.S. national security, even after the fall of the Hussein regime.
Have you just redefined our mission?
Now, Mr. Chairman, this is the view of the administration with respect to the
Let me
continued
just
validity.
understand what you've said. It's the view of the administration that as long as there's trouble in Iraq, that you have authorization of this Congress to continue there in perpetuity
That we
and
have
define trouble as you desire.
that we have authorization to defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq.
I thought that we heard from General Petraeus in a rather well-publicized session that the only reason we were there is to prevent all heck from breaking out and have the Iraqis then become responsible for their own security.
Mr. Chairman, General Petraeus has outlined repeatedly, as have other senior administration officials, the variety of threats posed in and through Iraq to U.S. national security interests.
So what you have described is a never-ending process in which our troops can be required to remain there in Iraq, in combat, for as long as they want.
Mr. Chairman, what I have stated is that the administration believes it has current authorization
When does that authority end?
when there is no longer a threat to the national security of the United States posed by Iraq.
Is Iraq about to attack the United States?
It is not a question of the state of Iraq itself posing that threat, but the threat posed by the situation in Iraq, by elements present in Iraq.
Could you give us a projection of when, and this is maybe hypothetical, but what you've described seems to me as an unending, never-ending, unable to end process for as long as there's a threat in Iraq that you, I would assume, would not deign to describe and quantify as to how it ends or when it subsides.
Mr. Chairman, we believe the security situation in Iraq in all of its dimensions has significantly improved over the course of the past year. We anticipate a continued such improvement, and as that improvement goes on, the role of the United States, the mission of the United States, the President of the United States will certainly change in Iraq, both the nature of our combat role, the nature of our role in support of Iraqi forces, the character of our presence in every respect, but we do contemplate the continued need for that presence beyond the end of this year. Yes, sir.
So you're saying it's a very subjective evaluation that the administration has,
Mr. Chairman.
and that we have given them an open-ended, interpreted by them exclusively, authorization to continue a war that is draining us of our integrity, of our resources, of the blood of our brave young people, of our prestige that so many have died for over the past 2 1/3 centuries, that can go on, this bloodletting can go on, this demoralizing of our forces can go on, the suffering of our people at home can go on, for as long as this administration perceives that there's a threat without ever defining that threat and ever needing to go to Congress or the American people for authorization ever again.
Mr. Chairman.
Is that your position?
No, Mr. Chairman. This administration has defined and has stated quite clearly what we believe to be the threats to U.S. national interests, to the interests of our friends and allies in the region and around the world, by elements present in Iraq and indeed by the situation in Iraq as a whole. We have also
Do
described,
those threats exist elsewhere?
Mr. Chairman, many other threats to U.S. national interests exist elsewhere. We are speaking to the situation today in Iraq.
We are, but I just want to understand your philosophy and where this administration thinks it can go. Because it seems to me, and maybe others on this committee, I'm sure, that there are al-Qaeda types in many other countries that pose a threat to the United States, that the damage and destruction that was done in the United States on September 11th didn't emanate from Iraq, but from other places, from other people that came from other countries, countries that still harbor those people in places other than Iraq. Does that mean that this franchise is open-ended and you have a right to do that anywhere in the world without authorization?
No, sir,
Then why only in Iraq?
because Iraq poses a specific case in which we do have authorization provided by the Chapter 7 mandate of the UN Security Council.
What authorization do you have?
Mr. Chairman, at the request of the Iraqi government, we also have, in the view of the administration, the continuing authorization of the U.S. Congress to deal with this threat.
You've said two things. At the request of the Iraqi government, that means our troops are directed by any government anywhere in the world that requests them, and that Congress has authorized you to respond to that threat that you perceive?
No, Mr. Chairman, what I said was, you asked about the authorities we believe exist in Iraq. There are two such authorities. The Chapter 7 mandate, which is a mandate requested by the government of Iraq, and the mandate provided by the authorization for use of force provided by the U.S. Congress.
So it's fair to say that it's the President's exclusive judgment as to when this threat ends?
The President has made very clear that he will assess the presence, character, mission of U.S. forces in Iraq based upon circumstances on the ground.
And that's exclusively his province?
I will not elaborate further beyond that very clear statement.
Does Congress have a role in making that determination?
Mr. Chairman, the President's responsibility is to assess the circumstances on the ground in Iraq and determine on the basis of that assessment.
Does he share that responsibility with anybody?
He shares that responsibility, sir, with his commanders on the ground and with their chain of command.
And not with the American people and their representatives?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, the President ultimately answers to the American people and to the U.S. Congress.
I would suggest ultimately is coming real close. I would suggest if that's the attitude of the administration, that you will see fewer and fewer members willing to fund this war, because you're describing the pit as bottomless. You're describing the process as unending. You're describing an administration that is stubborn and unbending. And you come here with a point of view that you'll answer the questions that you pose to yourself and not the questions that we and the American people have. Mr. Rohrabacher, I think my 5 minutes are up.
God, is it 24 hours already? Did you get that paper for us? I mean, you've had all this.
Still on the way, Mr. Rohrabacher.
The letter is in the mail.
Let me just say that I admire your patience in a number of arenas. And I think you answered the questions very well today. And I appreciate you being here. I'm sorry it took so long to get you here and to get the administration to come here. And I realize that you have, that you have to put yourself through this type of, I don't know if it's interrogation or not, but I would say that if you would have come here the very first time, it might have been helpful. So, but realizing that the questioning that you faced probably was the same type of questioning that you just went through. With that said, let me say that I do disagree with my chairman on a number of issues. I do believe that Congress has had every chance to end the conflict in Iraq if they wanted to. I haven't seen my colleagues moving to cut off all appropriations. Does Congress have the right to cut off appropriations for ongoing military actions?
Certainly it does.
I think they do. I think we have, if the majority of people in Congress want to cut off appropriations, they can cut off appropriations. Does the War Power Act, let me just note that Chairman Delahunt will be holding a hearing, the first of 3 hearings on regarding the War Powers Act very shortly. And I would say that the majority of the questions that were just posed to you would be more appropriate at that hearing about what the powers are of and where the authority lies in the United States government in terms of conducting military operations overseas than it was in this specific hearing, which was called specifically to find out details about the 2 agreements that are now being negotiated, the strategic framework and the other agreement that we have there, the force structure agreement. And you were supposed to answer questions about that today. Again, at any time that Congress really doesn't want you there, Congress can cut off the funds anytime. And somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but every year we have to have appropriations, and every year with one amendment to the appropriations bill saying that no money shall be used in this appropriation for military operations in Iraq, that would have ended it. So Congress has authorized it by not acting and by actually appropriating money that will be used there, as well as Congress has actually had votes on whether we should pull out. And I would suggest that if we haven't had the votes and you think the votes are there, we should have the votes. Let's do it. And but instead, there's some sort of conspiratorial, cloud that seems to be materializing here in this room. And although I will have to tell you, I don't like the attitude of the administration on a lot of things. In fact, we had to beg you to come here and talk to us is one of the attitudes I don't like. But in terms of how we got into Iraq, it's very clear. And it's also very clear that Congress still has a lot of authority that it is not exercised. I will be very anxious in the future to go through the hearings with Chairman Delahunt as to his proposals that might enhance the power of Congress or the American people to ensure that situations like this ongoing conflict don't happen again. But I found your answers to be specific to the questions at hand. Let me ask you this. What's the population of Iraq?
It's about 28 million, sir.
28 million. And in terms of the oil reserves in Iraq, what do we think the oil reserves are in Iraq?
They are among the largest proven reserves in the world. I can't give you a specific barrel figure.
Right. So we got 28 million people, and we've got perhaps the largest oil reserve in the world.
Among the largest reserves.
Yeah. Perhaps even the largest. We don't know, but it could be the largest, but it's way up there. We got enormous oil reserves for 28 million people, which is only 1/10 our population, of course. As you're negotiating these agreements, you have said there won't be any permanent bases, but you have, of course, indicated that and by the way, just so you'll know, before I go on to this next point, when I say that the Congress still has enormous authority to end the conflict in Iraq, if it so chooses, this is the reason why the administration will have to consult with Congress in the future. It has nothing to do with these 2 agreements that are now being negotiated in Iraq, but if whatever happens, whatever this administration or any other administration comes up with, they will have to consult with Congress or we will exercise the power of the purse, as we should, which is what the authorities granted to us by the Constitution. As long as you do make sure that, and if they don't consult with us, if this administration or future administrations don't consult, we can exercise our authority without consulting them. Now, with that said, back to the oil issue. So you got 1/10 our population, and probably in the future, if we are successful, does that mean that the Iraqi people will be potentially one of the richest peoples in the world?
Congressman, if the Iraqi government we're able to fully exploit through a modern hydrocarbons law and the investment that would flow through and with such a law, its hydrocarbon sector, as other states have done. Yes, we believe the potential wealth of Iraq from that sector, from a modern agricultural sector and industry, would be considerable.
They could be one of the richest countries in the world. In fact, it's conceivable they could be richer per person than our own people 10 years from now. If everything goes the right way, they might be richer than the people of the United States and the richest people perhaps in the whole world. Now, here's my question. As we're negotiating these agreements, is part of the agreement that they're going to help pay for the massive expense that we've had in saving them from Saddam Hussein and saving them from radical Islam and perhaps giving them some buffer so that they can be safe from different evil forces in that region?
Congressman, that is part and parcel of everything we are doing with Iraq, not just these agreements. The concept that Iraq must pay for its own development, that Iraq must fund its own security forces, that Iraq must fully utilize its resources for its own people is absolutely a premise of our policy there. And the 2008 national budget, which was just approved last month, makes a further dramatic step in exactly that direction. And I assure you and assure the Congress that remains a primary focus of the administration in all of our dealings, not just on these agreements, with the Iraqi government.
Well, I will have to remind the witness that early on, there was a proposal by my friends on the other side of the aisle that we demand a certain amount, we demand that repayment would be made and that be part of our effort there, and I think it might have been a tax on oil or something like that, that it be, but that they understand that the money that we spend there will be repaid in the end if we are successful in our determination to create a stable society there. And the administration opposed it heavily. And in fact, I was one of the few Republicans that sided with my Democratic colleagues to support the contention that right off the bat we should tell the people of Iraq, we're willing to help, but if we succeed, you're going to be the richest people in the world and we expect to be paid back. The administration actually opposed that. So I would hope that there's some tangible thing that I can latch on to that will assure me, maybe perhaps in the form of another resolution, perhaps the chairmans would consider a sense of the Congress resolution that these agreements with Iraq include specifically repayment for the money that we expended in securing the freedom of the people of Iraq and the stability of the people of Iraq. Now, Mr. Chairman, with that, I again would just like to state that I'm very pleased with your answers. I think that you were answering specifically to the specific questions. You were not asked to come here to do a general analysis of the Iraq war. You were here and the powers and the balance of powers in our government. You were here to brief us specifically on these agreements that are being negotiated, and you have come here and answered questions about those agreements specifically, without hesitation, and directly. And I appreciate that, and would hope that the administration continues to come here to answer those specific questions that you were invited to.
Congressman, we are very pleased to pledge to you, as our principals have pledged, to continue these consultations and to continue these briefings during this process.
Okay. The only thing I would say to that is that you only got a few more months. It's a little late that attitude begins to emerge. And frankly, the administration, one note, I worked in the Reagan White House for 7 years. I remember very clearly when President Reagan decided that we needed military action against Gaddafi in Libya. I remember that day very clearly, and I remember the congressional leaders that were brought into the White House at that time. This idea that we have to consult because that's the way we can succeed as a people, that was fully understood back in the Reagan years. I'm afraid that that understanding is not being demonstrated as well in this administration. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. Before turning to Mr. Delahunt, I would just remind our visitors to try not to make any comments as it is distracting both to witnesses and members participating in the hearing. Mr. Delahunt, Chairman Delahunt.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Ackerman. And let me remind my friend and colleague from California that I think it was the Deputy Secretary of Defense who told the American people that this war would cost the American taxpayers practically nothing. Well, here we are, heading up towards $1 trillion. But be that as it may, I just want to be clear, Ambassador. So it's the current intention of the administration to craft two separate agreements?
Yes, sir.
So there would be a status of forces agreement that would deal with the more mundane legal issues, delivery of the mail, et cetera.
Mr. Chairman, the status of forces agreement will provide for authorities and protections for U.S. forces.
Would it provide authority to fight as reported in the op-ed piece by the secretaries?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that document will indeed provide the necessary authorities for combat operations and associated detainee operations. What it will not do is require, commit, or specify such operations. It provides authorities only.
In other words, can you point out to me another status of forces agreement that embraces the authority to fight?
Mr. Chairman, there are other status of forces agreements in effect around the world which provide very specific authorities, including kinetic authorities.
Kinetic authorities, that's a word I don't understand. Could you expand on that?
Maritime interdiction, search and seizure, drug interdiction operations that can involve the use of force.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything comparable in any of the status of forces agreements that would allow the kind of combat or military hostilities envisioned in our experience in Iraq?
While many status of forces agreements have broad language referring to possible actions, this status of forces agreement will be specific on the scope of combat and associated detainee operations, which does render it different.
So it is different?
In this respect, yes, sir.
Okay. Well, you know, there was testimony earlier this week, or last week rather, because I posed that question earlier to Charles Mason of the Congressional Research Service. He reviewed some 70 so-called SOFRs and could not find one example of a status of forces agreement that embraced the kind of military operations that we've observed over the course of the past almost 5 years now in Iraq.
If I may, the ambassadors asked me to provide some detail on this. There are a number of our status of forces agreements that have both classified and unclassified portions. Speaking only to the unclassified portions, there are those, Belize comes to mind, those in Colombia.
Belize?
Belize, Colombia, that talk broadly about support to counter narcotics, support to maritime interdiction, as the ambassador noted, and support to support to counterterrorism activities that are broadly noted but not specified.
Yes, Ms. Lawn, but those do not talk about the initiation of search and destroy kind of missions that we know are currently undertaken in Iraq, do they?
That's correct, Congressman. And
Thank you.
most of them also have a catchphrase which we rely upon broadly, which is other agreed upon activities, other agreed upon operations, under which the department normally relies for specific kinds of activities that we don't elaborate. But you're right.
Right.
This will be a different kind of
This will
SOFA.
be a significantly different breed, if you will, of status of forces agreement. And you don't intend to submit this particular status of forces agreement with its authority to fight to the Congress for its approval?
The Secretary of Defense has already testified, and I believe Secretary Rice has reiterated that it is our intent and our obligation to coordinate with the members.
I understand coordination is a lovely word, and I know consultation and notification are also words that are being used and will be used. But I use the word authorization. It's the position of this administration that they do not need to come before Congress to receive authorization.
That's correct.
That's correct.
I have to tell you, I find that, well, I was going to use the word tenuous. I don't think it is strong enough. Because if your sole reliance is on the October 2002 resolution to link the authority to use military force post the expiration of the UN mandate and rely on that particular authorization, it just doesn't connect. The context, I dare say the legislative history, that was a time when there was no al-Qaeda in Iraq. That was a time when the focus of the administration and the U.S. Congress was on Saddam Hussein. I would suggest that it borders on the absurd. Now, let me go beyond that. It is absurd to make that argument. Now, you express concern about the status of the forces there and conferring on them the requisite immunities from Iraqi law. Is it true that if the UN mandate was extended for a short period of time to allow a new administration, a new president, and a new Congress to confer and to collaborate, that according to the UN mandate and to current Iraqi law, that being the so-called Order 17, that those immunities and protections for our military forces and others would continue? Is that an accurate statement?
Mr. Chairman, if the current content of the Chapter 7 resolution were to be extended, it would so extend the provisions in Iraqi law that embodied CPA Order 17.
So in other words, our troops would be protected from the reach of Iraqi law and would continue to be under the jurisdiction of the United States military. Is that an accurate statement,
In the case
Ambassador?
that the current authorities of the Chapter 7 resolution were extended. Yes, sir.
Right. We talk about consultation, and the Department of State has a procedure. I think it's described as Circular 175. And in there are references to consultation with Congress. Can you identify for the members of this panel what members of Congress whom you have consulted with?
Indeed, Mr. Chairman, we have had 7 such consultations in recent weeks. We can provide a list.
When was the first consultation that you had?
We can provide to you the dates and the members present, staff present at those consultations.
You've had 7 in the past several weeks, and yet the declaration of principles was signed by the Maliki government and Prime Minister Maliki and President Bush on November 22nd of 2007.
That was a political understanding which did not trigger those consultations, Mr. Chairman.
Well, did it signify an intent to negotiate?
It stands on its own ground as a declaration of mutual intent
to
proceed on a partnership
To proceed on the partnership, to, other words, have discussions regarding the principles to determine whether there could be a long-term agreement.
Mr. Chairman, we did not believe that formal consultations as required by the Circ 175 procedures were required in the case of the Declaration of Principles. They do apply to the documents we are now in the process of discussing, to the status of
And
forces.
you've had, is there currently a draft of the status of forces agreement in existence?
We are literally, Mr. Chairman, in the process of finalizing that draft internally this week.
But there is a draft.
There is a draft being worked, yes, sir.
And there has been a draft that's been circulated.
Well, of course, sir. We have been working on this for some time.
And there was a draft that was leaked to the New York Times, because I think it was maybe 6 weeks ago that the New York Times reported that there was a 15-page document that was being discussed.
Mr. Chairman, I can't speak to what documents the New York Times may have had its hands on or believe.
Did you have a
So-
chance to read the story, Ambassador?
Yes, sir.
Did it sound familiar to you?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to comment on New York Times stories.
I'm not asking you to comment on the New York Times story. I'm asking you to comment, was there a draft that's been in existence for several months, that's been circulating within the administration?
Mr. Chairman, there have been many different drafts discussed, rejected, amended, revised, evolved, and I really can't speak to which of those drafts, if any of those drafts in full, a New York Times reporter obtained.
But there was no one in the administration that felt that it was necessary at that point in time to consult with appropriate members of Congress.
Mr. Chairman, we were still in the process of deciding exactly what content we wanted in this draft, which has yet, as of today, to be prepared in a form that can be presented to the Iraqi government.
Would the gentleman yield for one moment?
Of course.
Just some advice. It might be to your benefit that when you're going over things and coming up with a final decision of what your position is going to be, to come up to Capitol Hill and maybe bounce the idea off some other elected officials. That might actually help get the situation resolved in a way that both the House and the Senate on one side and the executive branch on the other side can actually implement a policy instead of waiting until you've made up your final decision and then get your guns going in order to steamroll whatever that position is over any opposition that might exist here on the Hill. So you might think about that as a future method of operation, but I understand that you're not the one who sets that method of how you're going to determine such issues. Thank you. I yield back.
Reclaiming my time, I think that might have been a good suggestion. You know, I don't think it's the best practice for consultation. You indicated that you're not familiar, you don't rely on stories printed in the New York Times. Well, I would suggest that neither should the United States Congress rely on op-ed pieces done by secretaries of state and defense, that there should have been consultation heretofore. There clearly, I can communicate to you that, in my opinion, there is a canyon of difference between the perspectives of the majority here in Congress and the administration on this particular issue. And I believe the overwhelming opinion by constitutional scholars, this is not just about, as I said in my opening remarks, about a bilateral agreement between Iraq and the United States. It's about the role of Congress in making a decision in terms of authorization of military force. It's applicable whether it's Iraq or Bosnia or Kosovo or anywhere else in this world, or Pakistan. This is about this institution. And it is time that Congress recognizes its responsibility, because we have an obligation to assert the obligation that was conferred upon us by the Founding Fathers, and to suggest that a authorization for military force that was voted on in October of 2002 serves as a basis for continuing authority to wage combat in Iraq post the expiration of the December 30, post the expiration of the UN mandate, I believe is just not even the thinnest of reeds. I think it holds absolutely no water whatsoever. I have been working with my colleague from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro, on legislation that I hope we will have prepared sometime this week, which would be a sense of Congress that, particularly given the lame duck status of this administration, that the mandate of the United Nations be extended for the next president, whether it be John McCain or Senator Obama or Senator Clinton, to work in a collaborative, consultative way with genuine consultation to determine and chart the future course of the relationship between Iraq and the United States. You know, for this administration on its way out the door to attempt to advocate and argue that this is there is some sort of continuing authority pursuant for the presence of our military forces and permitting them to engage in hostile actions in Iraq, I find unbelievable. With that, I yield back.
If I might just ask one question before going to Ms. DeLauro. I have no problem with the administration serving as the administration until its final minute in office. That's what you should be doing. But you should be doing that with us as well. We're out the door every 2 years. But that doesn't mean we should abdicate our responsibility. And the difference in perspective is that we might have made a mistake, but that doesn't mean we're going to keep making it. Other people don't seem to have that attitude, and I think we have to talk to each other. So I ask you one question. Will you commit to us that you will provide this committee and this Congress with a copy of the strategic framework and the SOFA agreement before you run it by the Iraqi government?
Mr. Chairman, we will certainly brief on our intentions with respect to that text and the negotiation, but we do not, as a matter of practice, share negotiating texts. That has not been the standard practice of this or any other administration. This is a document that is about to enter negotiation with another government. We will brief, as we have been briefing, staff and members fully on it, and will continue to do so. But I will take your request specifically back to the administration.
That you have fully briefed is something that some people might deign to quibble with over the years. We don't want to interfere with the administration's negotiations. That is not our role. That's your prerogative. But I think if we can all set aside the hubris that it's just possible that one member of Congress might have a good idea for you to offer up before you offer it up to the Iraqis. And I would hope that you would think that the American Congress and that the American people are your preferred partner in deciding our place in the world before going off and negotiating it with others. Because if you don't have the full support of the American people, and you think that only the administration can come up with good ideas, then that's a very sorry state of affairs. We are not the enemy. and we've not declared war on the administration. We want to be helpful. We don't want, I don't know of any Democrat that wants our administration to fail in making America as good as its people and restoring our position in the world. We should be your allies in trying to do that instead of fighting us each and every step of the way. We come to this head-on loggerheads kind of a thing based on lack of information, cooperation, forthrightedness, refusing to answer the questions, obscuring the answers, which should not have to be. Mr. Laura.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me try to make a couple of points and ask a couple of questions. The strategic framework, is that the same as the Declaration of Principles?
No, Madam Congresswoman.
What weight does the Declaration of Principles have with regard to the strategic framework?
It's a broad statement of intent. The strategic framework's content will reflect the topics that were outlined in the Declaration of Principle. They will be elaborated further in many regards. It will not be at variance with the Declaration of Principles, but its content will be different in terms of detail.
Well, but that Declaration of Principles, quite frankly, and you've indicated that it didn't really need to have any consultation by the Congress, but it has been described by many academics and people who study these efforts as going much beyond what other status of forces agreements. It really rose to the level of what would be contained in a treaty. But I want to get to this question. Should we then just, I mean, it was signed by two heads of state, if you will. The President of the United States and the al-Maliki government signed the Declaration of Principles. Should we abrogate the Declaration of Principles, scrap it?
I don't understand your question, Madam.
Well, put it aside, because, I mean, on the security side of the thing, it talks about security assurances commitments to deter foreign aggression against Iraq that violates its sovereignty and integrity of territories, water, airspace. Combat all terrorist groups, at the forefront of which is Al-Qaeda, Saddamists, and other outlaw groups. It goes pretty far. And if again, given the constitutional reactions or the commentary regarding the breadth, if you will, of the Declaration, and it is meant to be a guide. These are pretty specific items in this document. Why not then? Because you've just changed the language. It was a Declaration of Principles up until a few weeks ago, and it wasn't two, it's now two. I'll make this statement. There was a movement to go down this road with the UN mandate going to be expired at the end of this year, to move by July 31st to put into place a very, very far-reaching agreement beyond the scope of any status of forces agreement that currently has existed. Now, you've been found out. You have been found out. So now we're watching systematic backpedaling on some of these issues. Thank God. Thank God. But I'm just saying, let's put the Declaration of Principles aside. Let's not regard it, since you say it's really not going to be terribly informative of where you're going to come up with the fringes, and say, in fact, that this is not what we're about, this is not what we're going to do, and we're going to start afresh with consultation from the Congress and how we move forward in terms of our long-term involvement in Iraq.
Congresswoman, if I understand your question, do we intend to abrogate the Declaration of Principles? No, we do not. It is an accurate, factual, and comprehensive statement of the intent of this administration with respect to a partnership with the Iraqi government. It is a statement of intent that we intend to carry forward in the content of the strategic framework. The Status of Forces Agreement is a different document. As we have said, it provides authorities. It does not contain commitments.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that you've answered the question in the sense that I think we can look at this Declaration of Principles, which, again, not by myself. I'm not a constitutional a scholar. I am not a student of the international agreements, though I've read quite a bit about them in the last several months. I would just say is that this has been described as going beyond anything that has been identified as a status of forces agreement, and in fact, that the kind of language in this Declaration of Principles really has risen to the level of a treaty, and you don't want to go down that route to get Senate confirmation of a treaty. But I think that we can pretty much understand that this strategic framework, or whatever you now want to call this document, is going to pretty much look like this Declaration of Principles. Let me move aside to the status of forces agreement, which you do talk about here. And in your testimony, you say, within the context of the SOFA, options include a range of missions that the next administration may wish to pursue, such as helping the Iraqi government fight al-Qaeda, develop its security forces, and stop the flow of lethal training and aid from Iran. Iran's President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, just wrapped up a 2-day visit to Iraq, the first by an Iranian president since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. During the visit, he pledged $1 billion in aid, negotiated 7 deals pertaining to economic and cultural cooperation, and basically said the United States should go home. Is this what you're afraid of with regard? Is this what you're going to set up in your status of forces agreement, lethal training and aid from Iran, which Iraq is apparently very happy to receive assistance on? Let me further go on here. The Declaration of Principles signed in November highlights the goals of Iraq's regional economic integration, so this cooperation with Iran would presumably be welcomed in a sense. At the same time, the United States has tried to encourage the international community to sanction Iran, isolated from the rest of the world because of Iran's nuclear program, a subject of great concern to the majority of this body, and I assume both of you as well. But are these two objectives, Iraq's integration into the regional economy and the attempt to economically isolate Iran, at odds with each other in any way, in your view? And how does the goal of Iraq's regional economic integration fit with the broader U.S. policy priorities of seeking to isolate Iran because of its nuclear program? It seemed to me, and I just watched the TV, there was a very long red carpet laid out for the president, and a very close relationship with Iraq and Iran over the last several days. Can you comment about these two pieces, about the economic integration and the isolation of Iran?
Congresswoman, I certainly can comment in this session, and a much more detailed set of comments could be provided on the nature of this visit and the relationship between Iran and Iraq in another setting, a closed setting. But in this open testimony, what I can say is this: the United States has supported and will continue to support constructive, positive relations between Iraq and all of its neighbors, including Iran. But Iran's public declarations, most recently repeated by President Ahmadinejad, that Iran respects the sovereignty of Iraq, wishes to see a stable, secure, and peaceful Iraq emerge, are at sharp, if not 180-degree variance with the behaviors of Iran with respect to the provision of lethal training, lethal assistance to the most violent, most radical elements inside Iraq that contribute to the destabilization of that country. It is those behaviors of Iran, not to the fact of constructive or positive relationships between the two countries of Iraq and Iran, that the United States and indeed our Iraqi partners are opposed to.
Well, our Iraqi partners seem to be very clear about a strong relationship with Iran, they seem to be able to discern between destructive forces and constructive forces and are carrying out a dialogue with Iran to move forward to economic integration. And the United States, under this administration, can't seem to distinguish between destructive and constructive forces and refuses to have any conversation with Iran about the region and destabilization. I mean, I think it's really, and I don't know how you describe, I don't know if you know the details of the $1 billion in aid or the negotiated deals that were, if you're privy to all of those details. Yes, I will
Congresswoman,
yield to my colleague from Massachusetts.
Mr. Chairman, if I could please respond.
Sure, please respond.
Congresswoman, in fact, the United States, through the agency of our ambassador in Iraq and his team, have conducted several rounds of direct discussions with the government of Iran over issues relating to the security of Iraq. We are fully prepared for another such round, as we have been since October of last year. It is the Iranian government which, on occasion after occasion, has drawn back from agreeing to a date for the next round of such discussions. That offer, in terms of our discussions at the technical level, remain out there.
Well, I'm truly glad to know that those conversations are occurring, and I would hope they could continue to be productive for both sides, and that in your testimony, you really stop the flow of lethal training and aid from Iran. It's hard to know what you are. You make a statement like that, but you didn't make it in your commentary, that it really, you, in essence, on this issue, kind of really talk out of both sides of your mouth. Mr. Delahunt?
Yeah, I would just note, Ambassador, that it would appear that that your counterparts in the executive in Iraq have a different impression of the behavior of the Iranians. Again, this is just current. This is in the aftermath of Ahmadinejad's visit there, and as Congresswoman DeLauro indicated, he was apparently warmly received. But here we have Talabani, the president, occurred, saying that Tehran and Baghdad are brotherly nations who share many beliefs and values. Of course, dictators and foreigners, now I don't know if that is an allusion to the United States, have tried to tarnish and undermine the emotional relationships between the two states. Prime Minister Maliki says, I think that the level of trust is very high. And I say frankly that the position Iran has taken recently was very helpful in bringing back security and stability. Zabari, the foreign minister, says, we hope to engage, not fighting them, referring to the Iranians, that our long-term relationship with the United States, we will reassure them that Iraq will not be a launching pad of the United States to make attacks on Iran. I mean, this describes a totally different relationship, and I can appreciate that there's proximity and history that goes on here. But even in the Declaration of Principles, you talk about, actors from outside. Is the inference that we draw that be Iran or?
It absolutely is, not exclusively so, but certainly in large part is Iran.
Is Iran. Then we would seem to have a real disagreement with the Iraqi government in terms of the behavior of Iran, unless you're suggesting that these officials are just making these statements because of the political dynamic that exists in the Middle East and maybe in Iraq.
Mr. Chairman, I do not believe we are at difference with the senior officials of Iran.
I haven't
on the
heard any
substance of the
American
threat.
official making these kinds of observations about Iran and its behavior. So the only explanation then is that there is a significant difference, unless the Iraqis are whispering something to the Bush administration that they're not saying in public, and maybe they're whispering something to the Iranians about our relationship with the Iraqi government. But somebody isn't being forthcoming.
Mr. Chairman, we would be very happy to provide you or any member of this committee with a detailed briefing in another setting.
I
on this
understand.
subject.
I hear a lot of detailed briefings, and I prefer to do it out here in public, and if you can't say it, that's fine. But, the American people have earned the right to hear what you have to say. Let me just ask a final question, if I can, Mr. Chairman,
Can I take back my time?
after I finish this question.
Okay.
I know she
No, you go ahead, and as long as I can take back my time.
If you're claiming that the 2002 authorization to fight is still in effect, why does the administration therefore need to incorporate it within the Status of Forces Agreement?
That is not what we are doing, Mr. Chairman. The Status of Forces Agreement contains grants by the Iraqi government in a jointly negotiated document of operational authorities. It's two sets of authorities.
Okay. So in other words,
there's no incorporation of this within the Status of Forces
Agreement. I see. So there'll be nothing in there about the authority of American military to engage in combat.
There will be no reference to the congressional authorization. It will be effectively an Iraqi-U.S. understanding on necessary protections, privileges, and authorizations for potential operations.
And it'll be the presumption or the inference or the conclusion by the administration that they don't need that because of the October 2002 authorization.
That with respect, within our system, our constitutional system, that authorization continues to exist.
Fascinating.
If I can, Mr. Chairman, I just have one more question. The congressional authorization to use force in Iraq refers to several UN Security Council resolutions. Iraq wants out of the UN mandate at the end of applicability of these resolutions. So part of the resolution will no longer be applicable. The authorization also refers to Iraq's pursuit of weapons of mass destruction. That will no longer be applicable. The authorization further refers to Iraq's ties to terrorism. Do you believe that Iraq, as defined in the authorization, is the physical space that makes up the country of Iraq, or is it the government? It clearly means the government. You've got the Maliki government. Is the Maliki government pursuing weapons of mass destruction? Is the al-Maliki government supporting terrorist organizations? Is the al-Maliki government violating UN resolutions? Did the al-Maliki government invade Kuwait and use weapons of mass destruction on its own people? No. So, are you essentially saying that we authorize to use force against the country of Iraq and not the regime?
Congresswoman, we believe that a threat continues to exist in Iraq. We understand that there will be opportunities. Chairman Delahunt, we understand, will be holding hearings on exactly this topic, and that there will be a very detailed examination of all of these issues. We will be prepared to address these issues there.
But it harkens back to the authorization and the mandate, and this was part of the authorization as it had to do with the regime at that time. And unless this regime is engaged in these same kinds of efforts, we are now talking about a different set of circumstances that are described where?
Congresswoman, we believe that the resolution remains in effect. And again, a detailed presentation on these issues will certainly be forthcoming.
I think you pursue these questions, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Chairman, so we're not going to get any really straight answers to this.
Thank the panel for their courageous appearance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let me thank you for your commitment to provide us by 3 o'clock tomorrow with the answer to the specific questions as to the administration's interpretation of the Constitution after consulting with lawyers or whoever they will consult with, and I will be
I have one
happy.
final.
I would be happy to share the response with other members on and who have participated with the committee. We do have another panel, believe it or not, as you recall, of experts.
Can I just,
Chairman Delahunt had an additional question. That
if I could just indulge, I back in, on January 29th, I asked the State Department to deliver letters of invitation to 5 members of the Iraqi Council of Representatives who wished to come to Washington to discuss the future, a parliamentary exchange, if you will, which we do on a rather frequent basis here. They've had great difficulty in securing visas. First, they were denied entry to the U.S. Embassy unless they brought a U.S. citizen with them. They were told to apply for a visa like anyone off the street, and that would entail a wait, I understand, of some 30 days. Then they were told they need additional information besides a letter signed by myself on congressional stationery in order to authenticate their invitation. Let me say I have made that invitation to them. I want to be very clear about it. I think it's important that members of this legislative body hear and exchange views with members of the Iraqi parliament. And Ambassador, I would hope that a high level of cooperation, given this new spirit that we now seem to be enjoying in terms of notification and consultation, would be reflected in the expediting of those invitations.
Mr. Chairman, I checked on this issue before I came. I understand, and your staff has been in constant contact with our staff on this issue, that one visa has been granted. Another one of the individuals whom you were interested in coming is undecided about whether they wish to come. 3 other individuals may have made a decision not to travel, but we remain willing to facilitate this in any way we can.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll explore that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The panel is excused. Thank you for your participation today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks so much for inviting me along.
Delighted to have you.
Ambassador, this is very hard. Dying every day. Story of America wants out
Larry
of
Korb is the constitutional lawyer.
You see where the State Department is influenced.
Which
You're
Korb is
tired of
constitutional?
failed occupation.
Lawrence Tribe, I'm thinking of. Thank you.
And I have you on camera, sir, and I'm going to post it all over the place.
Excuse me, if you guys don't mind taking a seat, we have an adjournment. So if you guys aren't going to stop,
Oh, okay.
to leave.
We're leaving.
I'm sorry. Excuse me.
Thank you.
Would you like the big chair?
I think it's
I know, it's the second.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you.
Okay, so you can do whatever you want. Dr. Korb, we like you. He's 63.
Our second panel consists of Professor Oona Hathaway, Associate Professor of Law at Yale Law School. Before joining the faculty at Yale, Professor Hathaway served as law clerk for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor and D.C. Circuit Court Judge Patricia Wald. Professor Hathaway has been published in the Yale Law Journal, the Chicago Law Review, the Stanford Law Review, the Harvard Law Review. Professor Hathaway also serves as a member of the Advisory Committee on International Law for the legal advisor at the Department of State and holds degrees from Harvard and Yale Law Schools. Dr. Lawrence Korb is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a senior advisor to the Center for Defense Information. Prior to joining the center, he was a senior fellow and the director of national security studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. From July 98 to October 2002, he was the council vice president, director of studies, and the holder of the Maurice Greenberg Chair. Before joining the council, Dr. Korb served as director of the Center for Public Policy Education and senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Studies program at the Brookings Institution. Dean of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh, and Vice President of Corporate Operations at the Raytheon Company. Dr. Korb served as an Assistant Secretary of Defense from 1981 to 1985 and served on active duty for 4 years as a naval fighting officer and retired from the Naval Reserve with the rank of captain. Welcome to both of you. Your full statements will be made part of the record. And Professor Hathaway, let us begin with you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the committee for having me here today. I had prepared some oral remarks, but I have proceeded to tear them up in light of what we recently heard and draft a few comments, and then I'd be happy to receive questions. So I'll begin with the basic principle that I planned to begin with, which I think is worth restating once again, just to remind us all what the guiding principle ought to be in considering the proper scope of an international agreement concluded by the President on his own authority. And that is that the President cannot make an international agreement that exceeds his own constitutional authority. If he acts in absence of a congressional grant, he can only rely on his own independent constitutional powers. So what does that mean in this case? Here we're presented with two agreements that the administration intends to negotiate with Iraq. The first is a status of forces agreement, which traditionally is extraordinarily limited in scope. Traditionally, status of forces agreements include a negotiation of immunity for military officials and the very mundane day-to-day events that might be involved in having permanent forces stationed in a host country. What a status of forces agreement would not include is an authority to fight, immunity for private military contractors, any kind of mutual defense guarantee, maritime interdiction, which was mentioned, counter-narcotics actions, or anti-terrorism activities. Those are not part of a standard status of forces agreement. I have read a large majority of the unclassified status of forces agreements and have read extensive materials prepared by scholars about status of forces agreement, and the kind of status of forces agreement that is proposed by the administration based on the remarks here today far exceeds a typical status of forces agreement. Now, a typical status of forces agreement can and traditionally is negotiated by a president on his own authority as a sole executive agreement. But when you add into this agreement these kinds of additional commitments that far exceed a standard status of forces agreement, it is no longer an agreement that can be concluded by the President on his own authority. When it includes, for instance, an authority to fight, it becomes an agreement that really must be submitted to Congress for approval, either as a treaty or as a congressional executive agreement. There's the second agreement that was mentioned today, and that is a strategic framework agreement. From the written remarks, I had been led to believe that this was intended to be a binding agreement, and I'm pleased to hear that it's not going to be a binding agreement, but is instead going to be a non-binding agreement. It had appeared from the remarks that that agreement was, from the written remarks that Ambassador Satterfield submitted, that that agreement was going to include permission for U.S. and coalition forces to assist in restraining extremists and outside actors who who seek power through violence and terror. That's a quote from the written remarks submitted by Ambassador Satterfield. I now understand that that seems to be language that is instead going to be in the Status of Forces Agreement, which again, I emphasize, is not part of a standard Status of Forces Agreement, and therefore would have to be approved by Congress. If in fact the Strategic Framework Agreement is going to be entirely non-binding, that is, not create any legal obligation on the part of the United States government, then it is acceptable for that to be concluded as a sole executive agreement, just in the same way that it is acceptable that the Declaration of Principles itself was concluded as a sole executive agreement, though I would agree with Chairman Delahunt's remarks that although the agreement itself legally can be concluded as a sole executive agreement, the agreement that it contemplated far exceeded what the President could do on his own authority, and therefore there should have been consultations with Congress in advance of the issuing of the Declaration of Principles. Let me end simply by noting a very obvious and simple solution to the problem before this subcommittee, and that is the extension of the UN mandate. An extension of the UN mandate would deal with both the international law issues that the administration has rightly raised about the legality of retaining troops in Iraq after the expiration of the mandate, and would address the issues raised at the hearing today in regard to the House Resolution 114 regarding the authority to continue operating in Iraq as a matter of domestic law, because the second prong of H114 does provide for congressional authorization to carry out Security Council resolutions, and the UN mandate is obviously a Security Council resolution. So therefore, an extension of the UN mandate would address both of these problems and would give Congress time and the administration time to negotiate a fuller agreement in consultation with Congress and likely negotiated largely by the next administration. So with that, I end and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a very great privilege to be here. Let me briefly say I've been dealing with this for over 40 years. First, when I was deployed to Japan as a naval officer in '64, and then when I had the privilege of working for President Reagan, and among my responsibilities was installations. This is different from any standard SOFA that I've ever seen. It goes far beyond any of the agreements I've seen, either in government or out of government. And I agree with the professor that we ought to extend the UN mandate and let the next president, whoever he or she may be, make the decision. Now, as I understand it, it's the Iraqis that don't want to extend the UN resolution because they want to be recognized as a sovereign government, and I can understand that. But the fact of the matter is, they want an agreement with us to continue to protect them. They don't want us there as an occupying force. In fact, if you look at all of the polls in Iraq, they want us gone. The government wants us there to protect them. And I remind you that when the Iraqi defense minister was in this country a couple of months ago, he said, we're not going to be ready to take over internal security until 2012 and external maybe till 2020. Well, who do they want to do it? They want us to do it. And it seems to me that if, in fact, that's what they want us, the American people and you, their representatives, should have a say in exactly what they do. I think Senator Biden put it pretty well when he noted that this agreement has the potential to mire American troops in an Iraqi civil war indefinitely, especially if a sectarian Iraqi government determines who qualifies as an outlaw group or a Saddamist. And so I think that's the that is the key issue here is they want us there to protect them against, to use the words of our own Constitution, all internal and external threats to their security. So I think basically this is not something that we shouldn't enter into without full consultation and full congressional agreement on because it does have long-term ramifications. And since I see Congressman Rohrabacher here, I will remind him and the committee that President Reagan, among other things, submitted for congressional authorization our security commitment to the Marshall Islands and Micronesia.
See, whereas I was noted there, I take note, and I agree with that, and I agree with you. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. I think each of you noted that the Status of Forces Agreement goes far beyond Status of Forces agreements with which we are familiar. Does that mean that this proposed Status of Forces Agreement lacks moral authority or legal authority?
In my view, it does. I mean, because if it is not submitted to the Congress, for example, as our treaty with Japan and...
Submitted to the Congress for consultation or as a treaty?
It was submitted for congressional approval. My understanding is that you can have it ratified by the Senate 2/3 or by both houses.
Yes, let me simply add to that, if I may. I agree not only as a moral matter, but as a legal constitutional matter, that if the agreement exceeds the powers of the president, the sole executive powers of the president must submit the agreement to Congress. And in this case, the agreement that's contemplated does exceed the president's own independent powers and therefore must be submitted to Congress, and I agree, could be submitted either as a treaty or as a congressional executive agreement that would be passed by both houses of Congress.
Did you cite us examples of congressional executive approval agreements?
The Micronesian case is one of them. That is a case where there's a mutual defense treaty that was concluded as a congressional executive agreement. As a general matter, there
is no mutual defense in any of these documents. Iraq is not committed to come to our defense should we be attacked by Micronesia.
No, I think it's my understanding of it, that agreement, they weren't going to defend us, we were going to defend them.
Yeah, but I think the term is mutual security agreement. This is not a mutual security agreement. I'm trying to find the legal principle that might be violated here.
Well, the example that I cited in my written testimony, I think, is probably the closest analog to the situation that's presented here, and that is the 1951 agreement with Japan. And in that case, the United States concluded a treaty, it was as a treaty, with Japan in a very similar circumstance. It was a circumstance where the United States had invaded the country, had replaced the government, a new government was in place, ready to maintain its own sovereignty, and in order to transition to a different kind of relationship with the country, there was a negotiation of a treaty by which the United States received an authority to fight. The language is very similar to the language that's being contemplated here in Article 1 of the Security Treaty between the United States and Japan. It states, Japan grants the United States of America accepts the right upon coming into force of the Treaty of Peace in this treaty to dispose United States land, air, and sea forces in and about Japan. Such forces may be utilized to contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security in the Far East and to the security of Japan against armed attack from without, including assistance given at the express request of the Japanese government to put down large-scale internal riots and disturbances in Japan, etc.
We don't need the whole.
Well, this is, I think it's important to get the entirety of the article, and that's all but a couple words of it, because it is a treaty, and it is a treaty that provides the right to the United States to operate in Japan and to fight. And so the claim...
I don't mean to cut you short, but the sui generis nature of that agreement was based on the premise that Japan constitutionally neutered its own ability to defend itself by limiting its defense budget to 1% of its gross national product.
I agree with you. In fact, it's...
And therefore, in doing that, because of the concerns of the aggressive nature of the previous government there, the comfort level of the world had to somehow be met by Japan's agreeing not to have anything that looked like a modern-day military. And in order to get them to agree to do that, their question was, well, who's going to protect us? And that's why this elaborate negotiation and rather different-looking thing that we have with Japan, but there seems to be no, I would think if all the world agreed not to have a military and that we'd protect them and there was no other army, that would be a no-brainer for us.
My point is simply that the agreement, in fact, does not provide an explicit guarantee from the United States to come to the aid of Japan, and yet it was concluded as a treaty. That's the point.
Yeah,
and so
that's the strong point.
Yes.
And it's an important
Thank
point.
you.
And I might add that the Japanese have gone beyond the 1% realistically, and they also, their self-defense force, they keep, extending what that means. I mean, they're a significant military power right now.
Your interpretation of the Constitution, which I assume, I would hope that you don't think is a hypothetical document, but does it require the administration to come to Congress to continue what they think is their limitless mandate, as they've described it, to continue if they have military operations or at war or protecting Iraq?
In my view, it does, because...
Is this a close call?
I don't even think it's close, because as was pointed out before by Congressman DeLauro, that authorization basically had to do with the Saddam Hussein regime. It is gone. And so therefore, you're talking about, and then after Iraq, remember now that what happened was we had the Coalition Provision Authority, and then the UN mandate, and you had elections, and then you had an Iraqi government. That is the legal authority now. In my view, the 2002 authorization was over once you went to Chapter 7 under the United Nations. And now, since the Iraqis, remember, want that to end, you're coming up with a new agreement with a new government, and you're making pledges to that government that had nothing to do with the original invasion of an occupation of Iraq.
In addition to the answer of Congress has the power of the purse string and can end the conflict by refusing to fund it in any way, if this matter were brought before the Supreme Court, what would happen? Would they duck it? Would they take it up?
I'll let the law professor answer, but I would say one thing. We have never brought the War Powers Act to the Supreme Court because we're not quite sure what they might decide. Neither side wants to do it. And Congressman Rohrabacher was talking about when we attack Libya, under the War Powers Act, the president has to consult with Congress before he uses military force, and then within 90 days, if he continues to use it, he has to get a congressional resolution.
Professor?
So in my view, it is the power of Congress to declare war, and therefore whenever the U.S. government does engage in war, it is incumbent on the administration to receive approval from Congress for that action. And in fact, the House Resolution 114 is currently the congressional authority under which the action in Iraq is taking place. And that authority, in my view, the strongest argument that continues to exist is that there is an operating UN mandate that is encompassed in prong 2 of section 3, that the president is authorized to use armed forces to enforce all relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions regarding Iraq. In my view, when the UN mandate lapses, then that authorization under that prong will cease to exist unless there is a subsequent Security Council resolution further authorizing action. And that's why I would argue that an extension of that mandate would both be responsive to the need to receive congressional authorization for the continuing war in Iraq and the need to have international legal authority for the continuing war in Iraq.
Congress made authorization to the President in October of '02. Under that authorization, the first thing it says is the President's authorized to use the armed forces as he determines to be necessary in order to. And then it gives a two-pronged limitation. Defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq, and, a very important word, and two, enforce all relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions regarding Iraq. I believe that there are many extant UN resolutions that are still standing at this moment that the President can lay claim to need to enforce and has license to do so under this authorization. But it does say, and defend the national security of the United States, a phrase that was used repeatedly by Ambassador Satterfield. There seems to be very wide open language that we granted in this authority for this to be the President's call and the President's judgment as he determines to be necessary and appropriate. If he thinks there's a continuing threat from Iraq, and I don't know that they're suiting up against us, although they can easily make the argument about the snipers, it's not the government of Iraq or their army. It seems to me that word "and" requires both of them, doesn't?
In my view, they are in the alternative. But I think that this would be a matter for
You think
Congress.
"and" means "or"? Or do both of these need to exist for the President to continue having authority?
Well, I think that this seems to me like an issue that would be appropriate for Chairman Delahunt's next hearings on this issue of the declaration of war and the powers regarding the declaration of war.
We anxiously await answers 24 hours after your hearing, Bill.
Rely on Mr. Rohrabacher.
Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just note that I have in front of me a press release that was issued on November 26th of 2007, so that's way back in
Can you hear him?
November. There's a press release, the Declaration of Principles for Long-Term Relationship of Cooperation and Friendship between the Republic of Iraq and the United States, just sort of going through the type of things that are being discussed. And it's just too bad that we put out this press release and that
Who's it from?
you know, they're willing to discuss things with Congress through the press and not willing to come up here and discuss it with us personally. And that's hopefully with the initiative that Mr. Delahunt showed with Condoleezza Rice in requesting the witnesses for this hearing, that perhaps they'll pay attention to make it a little easier if they start consulting with us. About the War Powers Act. War Powers Act is still in effect, is it not? I mean, it was not repealed.
That's correct.
Now, let me note, again, for the record, when it came up to repeal the War Powers Act, for whatever reason, Republicans tended to support the request to repeal the War Powers Act, and I was one of the few Republicans who voted not to repeal the War Powers Act. I think it makes every sense in the world to have a use of force by the President done in cooperation with Congress rather than in opposition to Congress or in some way not being coordinated that way. Let me note that if we have a treaty that authorizes us to fight, or that would be basically a advanced authorization by Congress of the War Powers Act, would it not? If the treaty was then ratified by Congress.
In my view, yes. For example, if we were to come to the aid of Japan, if there were an attack, I don't think you would need another declaration.
Right. So what we have in the War Powers Act is if we actually have treaties, the War Powers Act that are ratified by Congress, we do not need then after 90 days to go to an authorization of Congress. And again, the War Powers Act is very specific that uses of military force should be done in consultation with Congress. And I would say there, although I have been somewhat disappointed in the quality of the consultation with Congress on this particular issue and some other issues, we have been consulted with about the ongoing war in Iraq. The ongoing war in Iraq is not due to some conspiracy. There is a definite disagreement, now that it's dragged on the way it has, there's a definite disagreement here as to whether it is in America's interest to stay in this conflict. It's not a conspiracy. It's not that we don't have the legal authority to tackle it. Again, to my two expert witnesses here, could not have Congress at any time just de-appropriate the money, meaning not put restrictions on our appropriations, saying that no money would be used for combat operations in Iraq? Could we not do that as a method of stopping this conflict if we wanted to, forcing the president to withdraw the troops?
Theoretically, you could. Practically, it's almost impossible.
It's only a matter of, it's not practically, it's whether in principle and in law, and in principle and law, we can do that.
As a matter of law, absolutely.
Say that again?
As a matter of law, that's absolutely a power of Congress.
Absolutely it is. And all this idea that we need more hoops to jump through and make sure that we have this authority to make sure the president doesn't go off the reservation and get us involved in this long-term thing. We can end it at any time. I remember very well the Vietnam War, and I remember very well the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed, and then all the Democrats kept going, oh, how horrible it is that we're staying in this Vietnam War. At any moment, the Democrats could have, at that point, they controlled both houses of Congress, just not appropriated money to be spent in Vietnam. And the same is here in Iraq. If people honestly don't want us to be in Iraq, then we should have we should make sure that we move to defund it. And in the process of looking at what are legal, what are the legal prerequisites for the president to utilize his power as commander-in-chief, I'm satisfied that with the War Powers Act, that consulting with Congress, he has a right to act as commander-in-chief and to deploy American military forces when necessary, and that 90 days later he needs to come and get some kind of authorization from us. That's in the law, and that's fine. Whether or not we have reached that stage now of authorization, that's, I guess, a debatable point, and I think we have. But for sure, there are other avenues, rather than the War Powers Act, of how to exercise our authority and exercise those for those who believe that the war is wrong. They have a way of handling this. Let me see now. We're talking about the certainly.
The War Powers Act is at best controversial. Whether it's constitutional or not is problematic, and that nobody wants to test it is a surety. I think it's one of those areas where we have predetermined ambiguity is the best American policy, which leaves us more latitude to act in these situations.
I'd love to test it, the Supreme Court.
Right, but it raises a question. If the administration is willing to say that the Constitution is open to interpretation, what's to prevent them to say that an average law is not open to interpretation?
I'll have to pass on
Would
that.
the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I guess it was more rhetorical
just a
than
couple
not,
more
but
points
it just raises a couple of puzzling concerns, which brings us back to it's the money, stupid.
Well, we have control of the purse, and reclaiming my time, I note here we're talking about a strategic framework, and we're talking about Declaration of Principles, Status of Forces Agreement. Let me note that what I'm suggesting here is that if indeed these do not require a congressional approval, if it does not, what that really means is that in order for us to deploy forces for any longer than 90 days, by the War Powers Act, we must have the Congress authorize that. Otherwise, but if we do have a congressional approval of these items, or any of these items, then indeed it might be interpreted as an advance approval by Congress, authorization to use force. And I think it's pretty well laid out here. I think that's an appropriate way for our system to work. And again, I'm a big supporter of the War Powers Act. I don't believe that I believe that we have to give the president leeway to deploy troops in emergency situations. Right. But if they do go on for more than 90 days, we need to make sure that Congress is involved. So with that said, I'm very pleased with your testimony. Thanks for reminding me of the Reagan administration and how Ronald Reagan did indeed bring something to have to be ratified by the Congress in a situation like this. And you've clarified a lot of the things that my thinking on this matter too. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to Mr. Delahunt's hearings on the War Powers Act and what changes may or may not be necessary. And one last note, I will just have to say, and this is my last thought for the hearing. I have to tell you, there are bad guys in this world, and the Islamic radicals who control Iran are bad guys. And I'm sorry, we can always try to say why the United States were paranoid, or we're really the bad guys, or we're causing the bad guys to do bad things. No, the Islamo-fascists who run Iran are bad guys. The Saudis who finance al-Qaeda are bad guys. And we got to deal with that. And it depends on how much influence we want them to have in that part of the world, and or whether or not we know if they dominate that part of the world and we leave ingloriously in retreat from Iraq, what that will mean to the safety in this part of the world. We, just trying to explain away the Iranian, as I say, Islamo-fascist regime is not going to make it any different than what it is, which is an evil regime that has financed terrorism, represses their own people, has slaughtered tens of thousands of their own people. And I'm not saying we should invade that country at all, but we need to recognize that it's a force in that region, and if we walk away, it'll be a stronger force in that region. So with that said, I appreciate this hearing, and thank you very much.
The chair will stipulate that the bad guys are the bad guys. The good guys are the good guys, and the reason the good guys are the good guys is because they're supposed to stay within the law. Mr. Delahunt.
Talking about the good guys and the law, I think, Mr. Chairman, the most distinctive aspect of our democracy is that we embrace the rule of law. And we claim that that's the predicate for how our democracy functions. And that's why this is such an important hearing. Because what is at stake here, as I said earlier, it's just not simply the relationship between the United States and Iraq, but our Constitution. And the gentleman from California is correct. If Congress approves of the Status of Forces Agreement or the Strategic Framework Agreement or a treaty, then the political branches have spoken in unison. And whatever that decision is, whether it's to stay and authorize combat after the expiration of the UN mandate, then it is legal and it is grounded in the rule of law, particularly the Constitution of the United States. I really believe that this is one of the most significant issues that this Congress will be dealing with between now and the end of this session. And I think today's hearing was very important because we now have out on the table, if you will, for the first time, some clarification. There are two agreements, that it's the position of the administration that Congress has no say. We are not part of whatever they intend to do other than the fig leaf of notification and consultation. Well, we have seen their commitment to consultation so far, which has been truly non-existent until the last several weeks when I dare say, Mr. Chairman, that you and I and others in Congress, because of our insistence upon answers and clarification, prompted that consultation. That is nothing more than just a bow, and I have serious reservations as to whether that would have ever occurred if you and I were not sitting in these respective chairs, and if, in fact, we had continued in the minority. But I think it's very important that we understand as an institution, we cannot abrogate our constitutional duty. It's Congress that has the power to declare war. This isn't just about the purse. That's reactive. We share the responsibility with the executive to declare war. And by declaring war, there are grades, if you will. Let's call it authorization to commit our men and women to combat. That's our response. We cannot abdicate this time that responsibility because we will be doing an injustice to the founding fathers who drafted this Constitution centuries ago, that knew that decisions about war ought to be collective and not allowed to vest in a single individual. That's what democracy is about. There is no more serious decision in a democracy than the decision to put our sons and daughters in harm's way, for whatever reason. And it's one that has to be done thoughtfully. Mr. Korb, you indicated that the Iraqis want to see the UN mandate expire. I'm not sure that that's the case. That's why I'd like to hear from some members of the Iraqi parliament whose objection to the extension to December 31st of 2008 was predicated on the fact that they wanted a timetable, like many of us here want a timetable. I'm inferring that they would have agreed and acceded to an extension if they knew we were going to leave at some point in time. I think it was the chairman that was, or maybe it was Mr. Laurel, that was alluding to the polling data that is as current as last September, which produced results that said like 70% of the Iraqi people want us to leave. Now, I think to avoid a constitutional crisis, because I dare say that if this administration insists on proceeding in a sole executive agreement to authorize our troops to be there, not under the aegis of a United Nations mandate, but simply relying on that October 2002 resolution, that we will have a constitutional crisis, that there will be a response from citizens, there will be a response that I don't think is necessarily healthy. But it's the executive that is not respecting the legislative body in its constitutional prerogative and obligation to make this a shared decision. We are not bringing it on. They are saying it's our way or no way at all.
I do believe we probably could get the Iraqis to agree to extend the mandate. They do not want to do that for the reason that you talked about, because if you extend the mandate, then they can't get us out, because as long as the UN mandate is there, we can stay. And I think you're right, both the Iraqi parliament and the Iraqi people want us to leave. And in fact, the opinion polls, even those conducted as recently as a month ago by General Petraeus, confirm that once again, that we're the cause of the violence. I also believe that if this administration were to submit an agreement based in any way, shape, or form on this Declaration of Principles, it would not be approved by the Congress. And I think they know that, because the American people basically, even though they originally supported the war, no longer do, and want us to get out in a reasonably quick time. And they know that this would prevent us from doing that. So I think that's the reason why they're pretending, in my view, that it really is nothing different than any of the other, to quote Secretaries Rice and Gates, the 115, SOFA agreements that we already have. But I do believe, based upon my conversations with the Iraqis, that they did not want it extended for that reason. And the Iraqi parliamentarians that you're trying to get to come up here have also complained that they weren't consulted on these Declaration of Principles either. And that's a parliamentary form of government.
Well, again, I mentioned, and I don't know if you were here, but, what drew my attention to this issue was that initially there was a letter signed by 144 members of the Iraqi parliament. Their parliament consists of some 275 members, that was forwarded to the Secretary General of the UN and to Secretary Rice, indicating that they wanted a timetable for withdrawal, otherwise they objected. The Maliki government just simply ignored them. I mean, if we're talking about, in the Declaration of Principles, defending the Constitution and democracy in Iraq, let's take note of that particular example, which contradicts this rhetoric that we read and hear that is embraced in the Declaration of Principles. I want to get back to the rather fascinating testimony today of the good ambassador, Ambassador Satterfield, where it is now clear that they recognize that upon the expiration of the United Nations mandate, there is no authority remaining for U.S. troops to engage in hostilities in Iraq. Is that your understanding, Professor Hathaway?
I would agree with that, though I think that what I understood from Ambassador Satterfield's remarks is that when the UN mandate expires, there will be no authorization as a matter of international law for the United States to remain in Iraq. My understanding is that the administration's position is that House Resolution 114 would still operate, but under the first prong, so that as a matter of domestic law, it would be the there would be an authorization for operation in Iraq. But you're absolutely right that as a matter of international law, there would be no.
Let me direct your attention to, the 114. If one examines the language of 114, it talks about defending the national security of the United States, a continuing threat posed by Iraq. One has to put into context the conditions and the facts and the realities at the time that that was passed. That was directed exclusively against Saddam Hussein. We heard much about weapons of mass destruction, links to al-Qaeda, all of which proved to be unfounded. I would submit that that first prong no longer exists because Iraq is no longer a threat to the United States. It is no longer a continuing threat. Saddam has been deposed, and we now find an entirely different set of conditions, and one in a review of the legislative history of the debate and the vote. It was predicated on a different reality than what is being suggested by the administration at this point in time. My position is there is no basis for their authority to remain in Iraq and engage in combat unless, and this is fine, and this is a decision for them to make, unless they return to Congress and seek authorization from Congress for the use of force.
I would agree that if they return to Congress and seek authorization, that would certainly satisfy the necessary requirements. If they sought and received an extension of the UN mandate, that would certainly satisfy the necessary requirements. There is a very serious question as to whether, without those, there could be said to be a continuing operation of House Resolution 114. And I'll note here that Ambassador Satterfield, I don't know if intentionally, but stated in discussing House Resolution 114 that there continues to be a threat, quote, in Iraq. But of course, the language says a threat posed, quote, by Iraq. And the two strike me as quite different.
I think that reading that you just related to us, I think is the linchpin. And I think it's such a reach, if you will, to interpret that first prong of that resolution to serve as a basis for continuing presence is false. And that's why they, I think, have made no effort to consult, that I suspect that they were hopeful that these issues would not be raised, and that Congress would just simply accede to a sole executive agreement. But it's just such a horrible precedent if Congress does not join the issue and seek a resolution. And I believe here we are in a presidential year where the likely nominees will either be Senator McCain or his two Democratic colleagues, and the American people deserve from them how they would handle the future bilateral relationship, not something that requires congressional approval, and yet this administration wants to do it as it slips out the door and simply do it by fiat, if you will. It's just not healthy for our democratic system, and at long last, I think we have outed, as Congresswoman Delora said, what the real intentions are. Let's have the debate. Any final comments from any of you?
I think their intention basically is to pass off this war to the next administration. We've seen them say that, they're going to delay I mean, once we get back to the pre-surge levels this summer.
But, you know, Mr. Secretary, that's fine.
Well,
The next administration might have a different idea in terms of the limitations and the boundaries of the use of American force in Iraq, in terms of time, in terms of mission. Let the next administration come to Congress and can figure out what those parameters are. Not this administration.
No,
they got us into this quagmire.
I agree with you, and I was going to give my second part of it, I was going to say, and then also set the terms for the use of those, forcing the next administration, putting them in a very difficult position if they wanted to make the changes.
I have just two concluding points, if I may. The first is that I think you're absolutely right that it's an extraordinarily dangerous precedent to set to allow the administration to define the status of forces agreement to include an authority to fight, because that is unprecedented, and that does involve the commitment of U.S. troops to engage in military activity in Iraq, and that kind of commitment is one that ought to be made in consultation with Congress. Second, I'd like to just mention that there is legislation, as you may know, that will likely be proposed tomorrow by the Progressive Caucus that aims to cabin the authority of the president and make explicit that any agreement that exceeds a typical status of forces agreement would have to be submitted to Congress for approval. And I think that that legislation or something like that is certainly well advised in making clear the constitutional right of Congress to participate in those conversations and those decisions.
Thank you. Just a few closing comments, as I thank you both for being very helpful. It seems clear to me that this administration is going to keep doing what this administration wants to do, regardless of anything, until somebody stops them. It seems to me that it's also the hope of this Congress, based on past experiencing, that we're hoping for the administration to pull the plug on itself. That's not going to happen. It appears that this administration is looking for any excuse to pursue the program that it wants to pursue, ignore the things that it wants to ignore, whether it be the American people, public will, the Congress of the United States, precedents that we've established throughout history, the law or the Constitution, and to find excuses to get around each and every one of them by just reinterpreting everything as they see fit. The distinction that you've just made, the difference between the threat in Iraq and the threat from Iraq, is blurred deliberately by the administration, because they just read that if there's a threat in Iraq, it's a threat to our national security, and the President has a continuing mandate from the Congress to proceed as he will if he perceives there's a threat to be against the United States, and he interprets that as he will. The fact that there was no al-Qaeda in Iraq prior to our entrance into the country is something that escapes them. Al-Qaeda in Iraq is there. They therefore seize on that as a threat within Iraq and from Iraq, and therefore necessitates their being there, because they don't want to leave and wants indeed to leave this as a problem to the next administration. The vagueness of the laws that we're dealing with seem to be in constant play, perpetual motion, every time we reach one of these unfortunate scenarios. And this is not entirely the administration's fault. Blame lies here in Congress as well. Just recalling history, George Washington sent letters back to the Continental Congress begging for money to be able to continue the war. And they had decisions to make as to whether or not they wanted to throw in the towel or fund the war. And thankfully, gratefully, history indicates that they hung in there long enough for him to miraculously prove that his skill and the skill of the fighting spirit of the soon-to-be American people would prevail. Commander-in-Chief George Bush is certainly not General of the Army George Washington, but neither is the Congress of the United States as decisive, although deeply introspective, as was the Continental Congress. But indeed, we have the ability to do this. And regardless of how the president interprets the law, if there's no money to pay the troops, Mr. General Commander-in-Chief, those boys are coming home. And this thing can be ended. It lies on our doorstep as well as the administration's. And what the will of the Congress is, whether or not they want to hang in there and miraculously pull this off under great dynamic leadership that has some new enlightened perspective on how to get this thing done, this thing is going to continue to be dragged out. I think the Congress is almost relieved that this administration is coming to its natural conclusion, because we don't want to make the decision, looking to the leadership of the next president of the United States, whoever that might be, to give us some sense of direction. If we was as determined as some of the members of this committee are, as a collective whole in the Congress, we could do this. I mean, of course, there's always a possibility of a runaway president saying the Congress doesn't know what it's doing. I still have the authority, and directs the Secretary of the Treasury to keep issuing the checks and send them on over to the defense people and keep on doing this, but we'll deal with that if we have to deal with that. That would be a completely runaway administration, and I don't think they would dare do anything like that. So there is a decisive way to end this thing and get around all the vagaries that we've been struggling with historically and which may never change, and that is to use the clear and decisive tools that are available to us at any given time and to cut off the spending. And some of us have made that decision to do that and have acted accordingly, but there's not a majority of us. But I think the administration hurts their own case in coming here to this committee and before the American people today with the attitude that they have, that they don't know what the Constitution says, they better talk to somebody because they didn't consider it on deciding these life and death policies that have us engaged in a war on the other side of the world. It's incredible that they expect us to believe that. And it's even more incredible that we don't believe it and still accept it and go along our merry way. We have a responsibility to be decisive and to try to convince our colleagues as to what the correct action is to do now, and not wait for enlightened leadership to come upon us by way of the next election, because that's going to take a while. And whether or not American young men and women are killed and maimed, or Iraqi innocent people are killed and maimed, or guilty people, or bad people, or any people, we can pull the plug on this thing anytime we want. And rather than just blame the administration, which we must do and will continue to do, there's no question about it, politics will have its way, and we're right to do that and have responsibility to do that. I think we have to be a little bit more introspective also. And we have to step up the action around this part of town. Mr. Delahunt.
Mr. Chairman, you know what's interesting is when we look at the expiration of the UN mandate, we're talking December 31st of 2008. A new president gets sworn in 20 days later. I think that in and of itself is a rationale, because for deferring, if you will, any agreement, and I appreciate the words that you've said, and I concur. I think, unfortunately, I think that Congress as an institution has suffered from a lack of courage. But this is just too important. And I would hope that in Iraq, people of goodwill there are and I'm sure they are cognizant of the dynamic here in this country, and that the American people, working with members on both sides of the aisle, reach a decision that if we could agree in a way to extend the mandate just for a short period of time, for 90 days, I'll just throw that out, that this debate would not allow a encroachment by the executive on the Congress's constitutional obligation, but would become part of the debate in the presidential campaign, in the part of those of us who are running for re-election, and for the U.S. Senate, so that we have a good, healthy, respectful debate on where do we go from this point on.
Final word, I think, despite the feelings that we might have listening to the testimony and trying to elicit answers on whether the Constitution is still in effect in America, and received little assurances, I'm just as concerned about what we're doing on the international stage and with the Iraqis in particular in raising the expectations based on what they have been told is going to happen, to give them things on which to rely upon that there is no reliance by an administration that's singing one song over here and not showing the flip side of the album to them, and making them believe that the music is very, very different. They have to make decisions that are going to determine their survival based on hopes and assumptions that they think we made by people who can say words that seem to have a meaning and really no intent behind it. I thank both of the witnesses. You've done us a great service and have been very, very helpful. Thank you. The committee stands adjourned.
It was nice to meet you.